Chapter 51 Ether Skills. They took turns going in, killing one beast at a time. At first, the process was long and tedious, involving long pauses to give Will, and especially Amy, time to recover from their emotions. But over time, the slaughter became faster. Will eventually regained his initial peace of mind, while Amy stopped crying after killing one of the chickens. The act left her pale and lost for a moment, but she was now able to bounce back. Soon there were no chickens or roosters, and they went to the rabbit cages, and the ordeal began again. The rabbits, unlike the chickens, were adorable, and taking their lives cost Amy even more. The sobbing session started all over again when she had to wring the neck of a newborn rabbit, and this time it took Will's help to console her. These animals gave little ether individually, but with their large numbers it became significant in the long run. As always, Jake simply stored it, while Will and Amy absorbed them directly. Few rabbits tried to escape. Jake suspected their oracle devices knew they wouldn't survive, and instead, incited them to let themselves be killed. If that was the case, it called into question the reliability of the oracle, and it was best not to overthink it. If ever there was a happy one in this situation, it was Crunch. The black cat clearly wasn't suffering from the same moral dilemma as Amy. The few rabbits trying to escape became its playthings, then its snack. Then they moved on to the ducks, the geese, and then the turkeys. When there were no small animals left, they took care of larger animals, whose necks they could no longer wring with their hands alone, or at least with difficulty. They then began to slit their throats, or in Jake's case, behead them to ensure their immediate death. Having a stun gun would have made things easier, but this was a farm, not a slaughterhouse. The sheep and goat pens turned into a bloodbath within a few hours, so much so that the metallic smell saturating the air frightened the cattle in the last pen, the largest of all. But paradoxically, once again very few tried to escape. Oddly enough, at this point, one could have imagined that the trio would have been totally disgusted or even traumatized by the horrors they had just committed. This was not the case, at least not for Jake. If Jake was feeling weary and disgusted with himself as he performed these acts, he was actually in a pretty good mood. He could now feel the influence of the digester's ether on him. If a fraction of digester's soul and memories affected him in this way, it gave him a good idea of what was going on in the head of one of these monsters. The digesters were undoubtedly the enemies of all life forms. Maybe they even attacked each other for all he knew. Will and Amy at some point changed completely as well. Disgust gradually faded, giving way to indifference, then a certain kind of enthusiasm. Not because they had psychotic tendencies, but because their ether storage was gradually filling up, and that meant a much better chance of survival. Especially for Amy, she was exhibiting an unusual behavior. In the midst of a calf killing, she suddenly took off her sweater and t-shirt, continuing the slaughter session in her bra for Jake and Will's greatest delight. She swung her saber faster and harder than ever, and seemed ecstatic, her pupils dilated, as if she was under the effect of a steroids plus amphetamines plus LSD combo. There was also a kind of aura around her, difficult to objectify, but if Jake had to give it a color, it would have been red, sprinkled with indigo. At that very moment, Jake finally understood what a Slayle meant by the fact that their ether code had been modified when they were assimilated on planet B842. The weaker they were, the more their ether codes would be modified to balance their odds. Unfortunately, they had no control over these changes, and they were, at least at their level, irreversible. Amy seemed to be endowed with some sort of frenzy skill. Maybe her victory over a digester the day before wasn't just a fluke. Perhaps her emotional breakdown had activated this new talent. Jake still hadn't felt the slightest difference and felt better than ever. This was because by the Oracle's standards he was in the top of the human race, and the only change in this case was the removal of genetic and physical defects. He hadn't really had time to examine himself from every angle, but the few moles or scars that he could remember had indeed been erased. Amy stopped for a second. "How are you feeling?" Red-faced and ecstatic Amy ignored his question, continuing to absorb ether with great saber play. He had to yell to get her out of her trance, and when he yelled, she blocked her ears shortly afterwards with a pained grimace. "Raph, don't scream so loud. I'm not deaf," she cried out, her face trembling with anger. Her reaction was so disproportionate that he could determine the effects of this strange skill even more clearly. The red and indigo ether composing her aura indicated that her strength and perception were magnified, and it clearly showed. The impact on her strength was obvious, but the impact on her perception led to some complications he hadn't thought of. The perception ether or indigo ether were the most expensive to produce, requiring 32 points of pure ether for a single point of ether perception. At first glance, this only concerned the amplification of the senses. Unfortunately, emotions had to be considered as sensations as well. Pain too, perhaps. The consequence was to make a person unprepared for it suddenly hypersensitive. Her mind was overwhelmed with information and was unable to stay in control. All you have to do is listen, Jake retorted in a stern tone. Now tell me what you see, what you hear, and what you feel. Jake's tone didn't allow for any form of challenge. Remembering that he was a professional killer of alien translucent monsters, Amy managed to pull herself together and began to describe what she was feeling. It's magic, she mumbled, trying to concentrate. I've always had great eyesight. I had a 12/10 on my visual acuity tests, to say the least. But now, it's like watching a black and white movie and suddenly switching to color. Everything seems more real. The colors are richer. I feel like I see an infinity of nuances that I didn't notice before. I see details in the distance, which would have been blurred or invisible, and perhaps even new colors, which I can't describe. In fact, I didn't know they existed. Please continue. What do you hear? Jake encouraged her. I hear much better, maybe too well. I have trouble distinguishing and separating the sounds I hear, so much so that I have trouble focusing my attention on anything. But the worst thing is, I think, the mixture of all my amplified senses. The friction, the changes in temperature, the contact of the wind, the smell of grass, blood, and even my emotions. I feel edgy, and the mixture of all these sensations has like a psychedelic effect on my mind, to the point that I feel like I'm on a cloud. At the same time, I feel terrified because I have no control over it all. Jake calmly digested the young woman's revelations, making many inferences from her words. Jake was able to conclude definitively that the ether did indeed behave as an amplifier, and therefore the result depended on the fundamentals of the person being amplified. Infinity multiplied by 0, it was still 0. In other words, according to this logic, a blind person could not hope to regain his sight by considerably increasing his ether perception. Unfortunately, it also meant that people were not equal to equivalent ether, which would seriously complicate his assessment of the future dangers. Will, for example, had bad senses and even wore glasses. If he had the same skill as Amy, he would only regain normal vision at best. Will even admitted to having little or no sense of smell. The metallic smell of the blood around them didn't bother him much either. Amy, on the other hand, was in perfect condition and much more sensitive. The result had exceeded the immediate analysis capacities of her brain and would certainly require an adaptation time more or less consequent. It was even likely that an excessive amount of perception ether could overheat and then short-circuit their brains and drive them into madness if they abused it. This explained why the intelligence ether was cheaper. By developing the brain early, one was better able to withstand the effects of increased senses. Either the oracle voluntarily lowered the cost to prevent most of them from becoming senile due to some wrong ether investment, or the perception ether had effects branching far beyond what they had observed. Jake immediately took the necessary steps to deal with these findings. Listen to me, Amy. Take a break and try to calm down. Now look in your status if you have a new skill you didn't have before. Nothing in my body status. She replied, frowning. Check your ether status, then. Jake advised her in exasperation. Oh, there is indeed a new line. The skill name is Frenzy. She exclaimed, with unhidden glee. For the originality of the name, well, they seemed better. But at least it suited her situation. Okay, now try to see if you can control it. Amy began staring at the floor, twiddling her thumbs in embarrassment. I can't. It activates whenever I'm under the influence of strong emotion. You just have to wait. Uffed. Will burst out laughing, seeing her cute reaction. It was like a child saying she didn't like chocolate cake, but her mouth was still smeared with the chocolate cake mysteriously missing from the table. Amy, still under the effect of her competence, burst out laughing in turn, rolling herself across the bloody floor, while Jake, as morose and socially awkward as ever, could only pray for a digester benefactor to come and get him out of this mess. Chapter 52 Predators. When Amy finally calmed down, the group was able to get down to business. The few cattle that had not fled before their arrival at the farm had been startled by the smell of blood and had rushed out of the enclosure towards the forest. Their slaughter episode ended there, since a panicked ox could prove fatally dangerous if driven into a corner. The session had also been quite demanding, both emotionally and physically. Will and Amy were exhausted. Amy in particular had not been a great sportswoman in the past, and her typically feminine build and musculature had made her regret her lack of drive for physical exertion. The saber forged by Jake was too heavy for her, and without her new frenzy skill, which increased her strength and put her in a state of ecstatic trance, she would never have been able to do so. Nevertheless, this feat had not come without a price. She was covered in soreness, her bones and joints cracking alarmingly with every movement. Her muscles were also abnormally congested and painful. Will was not to be outdone. Like any self-respecting businessman, he practiced a physical activity known as maintenance, simply to keep his body weight fit and healthy. His tall stature and decent cardio had kept him going until then, but he was very clear about his chances of survival in the face of another encounter with one of these monsters. His wounded lung was throbbing with every breath he took. Between the intensive morning walk and the intense effort to eliminate these poor animals, they had no juice left to last the rest of the day. Digester's blood could indeed speed up their recovery, but it did not solve the problem of their lack of stamina. Besides, their supply wasn't infinite, and Jake preferred to keep it for emergencies. All in all, Jake, Amy, and Will had collected about 16 ether points each, which was not insignificant. Combined, Jake now had 40 pure ether points ready to be spent. Seeing how tired they were, especially Amy, and considering that they still had a long way to go, he succinctly advised them to improve their constitution as a priority. Although investing their points in strength and agility seemed like a good choice, it did not serve Jake's purposes. Indeed, they might be stronger and more responsive in combat situations, but their mobility would be reduced in the long run due to exhaustion and physical injuries, such as sprains and tendinitis. Nevertheless, improving strength was necessary, as it indirectly increased the ease with which they would perform physical exertion. For example, a person capable of doing only one pull-up would not do much more even if he tripled his stamina. Comparatively, a strength gain between 20 and 35% could make it possible to achieve 7 or 8. In essence, being stronger at the same weight would make them feel lighter and therefore force less. Amy, who had her frenzy skill almost doubling her strength and perception ether, had such a sore body that she gladly listened to his advice and increased her ether constitution by 3 points. As for the remaining 4 points, she added 1 point to agility ether and 2 to strength. Will, who was still convalescing, had little choice. He invested 3 points in constitution and the remaining 4 points in strength. He immediately felt his breathing calm down and become less painful. Meanwhile, Jake decided to align his strength and constitution ether with the agility ether, raising them both from 13 to 16 points. The remaining points would be used on a case-by-case basis. The constitution ether had that miraculous quality that even a well-trained body could not attain. It was not necessary to eat or drink more or better to maintain this gain in endurance and stamina. The best of the Maratonians, who would have displayed a stamina, constitution subattribute, of at least 30 on his body status would collapse like everyone else after a long race if he didn't consume drinks rich in sugars and electrolytes. The stamina was real, but fully dependent on his fuel source. The ether, for the moment, cheated the laws of physics, since this endurance didn't require any particular change. By eating and drinking just the same, the Maratonian would run farther and faster. Put that way, the ether was indeed a clean source of energy. After a few sips of digester blood each, the group set off again under Jake's leadership, leaving behind a devastated farmhouse and a bloody scene straight out of a nightmare. After walking only 2 kilometers from the farm to the Red Cube, they found signs of escaped pigs. A kilometer further on, they found the body of one of them. The body was still warm, and hoof tracks split all around indicated that the rest, or at least part of the herd of liberated pigs, accompanied it. Half the neck had been torn off and the hindquarters eaten off. This could have been the work of a digester, but it could also have been due to an unwelcome encounter with another predator. A predator from Earth would probably have devoured the entire carcass or taken the rest of the carcass with it, unless it had been prevented from doing so. This was not at all reassuring, considering how few Earth carnivores were capable of tearing off half the padded neck of an adult pig with their jaws. A large lion, a tiger, a bear, maybe a crocodile. There may have been others counting aliens, but none of those cited had to blush when confronted with a digester LVL-1. Only those larger than them in size and capable of changing the shape of their extremities would trigger a flight instinct in these territorial animals. And again, nothing could be less certain. The largest bears could weigh nearly a ton and stand more than 3 meters tall, a size that was impressive even for these monsters. The real danger was if apex carnivores of their planet had arrived before them and therefore evolved prematurely. Considering how fast Crunch was growing, a lion or a tiger would not be good news. These predators were also gaining ether by consuming their prey. It wouldn't be long before the most dangerous among them would become an even more terrible threat than the digesters, if they became more intelligent. Thank God they didn't have to worry about harmful insects. Mosquitoes, for example, had a very short life expectancy. A little extra ether wouldn't give them time to become biological disasters, especially since these insects didn't have an oracle device in principle. They don't, but their etheric code was still modified when they were transported on B-842. If by chance some of these bugs suck the blood of a high-ranking digester, they can evolve quite fast. She interrupted him, shattering his illusions with her customary lack of mercy. Oh great, worse and worse. Jake sighed, taciturn again. What's the matter? Amy worried, as she saw his change in expression. Nothing. At least I hope so. Anyway, it was to be hoped that this predator was cowardly or simply too lazy or sated to carry away the remains of his prey. In any case, the ether had been consumed. Jake decided to follow the hoof prints of the herd, believing it to be a source of ether and food easily earned. If digesters were hunting them as well, they would at least have the help of the surviving pigs as a diversion. Moreover, they were going in the same direction as they were. Maybe these pigs were going to the Red Cube for their first ordeal as well. The pigs were moving much faster than they thought. Jake had accelerated the pace of the group, taking advantage of their improved physique and adapted outfits to push them further. Nothing fabulous, a little jog of 9 kilometers/h. For 4 hours. Not a single stop except to eat an occasional slice of jerky and take a sip or two of digester blood to invigorate Will and Amy. Jake hadn't felt hungry or thirsty once, despite traveling almost 40 kilometers. Not even a world champion on Earth could have done much better. Even though Jake was exceptional among humans, he should have eaten or drank like Amy and Will, but he didn't. Halfway through the race, he forced himself to snack on a piece of meat, but without pleasure. The magical effect of the ether of constitution was thus confirmed. Chapter 53: The Knight and the Bear. At sunset, the tracks of the pigs became more difficult to follow, despite the large number of hoof prints. Nevertheless, the signs of other creatures' passage became more apparent, especially those of the digesters. One of them was larger than the ones Jake had faced. Very different footprints preceded the herd. The size of the footprints looked like a bear's, and a big one to make matters worse. The big mystery was that the pigs were following in his footsteps, covering his tracks. The carnivorous mammal being their predator, the pigs should have taken a different direction instead of following it. The conclusion to draw was that it was running away from the same thing. And since no pig carcass had been found after that, not even blood, it meant that the digesters were not interested in them. Why would they ignore an easy prey? Ether? Jake wondered, frowning as he analyzed a sequence of mixed footprints, which seemed to indicate that the digesters were moving through the herd of pigs without taking action. They're hunting a bear, he concluded mentally. From now on, nobody talks anymore. Jake ordered in a commanding tone. In general, imitate my movements. If any of you scream or endanger us, I'll knock you out myself. Questions? No questions. Amy and Will mumbled, their throats tight and dripping with sweat. Then let's get going. A kilometer later, they began to hear those famous shrill cackles of misfortune. From time to time, a hoarse roar answered, followed by the restless squeals of the pigs. 2 kilometers later, The cries were getting closer and closer, and more roars were added to the first one. 5 kilometers further on, they came upon a lonely, living pig. The pig had broken its leg during its desperate escape and seemed to be at the end of its rope. Jake slaughtered it mercilessly and absorbed its ether. Forsaking the dead pig, he noticed a trail of blood associated with the paw prints of what appeared to be a bear. A debilitating wound, considering the amount of blood loss. The predator was living out its last moments and wouldn't get very far. If it moved quickly, it had a chance to stop the digester's pack from feasting on its corpse. "We're speeding up," Jake warned, starting to run at twice the speed he was running at before. Will and Amy looked at each other without saying a word, sighed, and then began to run behind him. Over the next 3 kilometers, they discovered more and more blood and more isolated pigs. Some dead from fatigue, others mortally wounded by a fall, and a few rare lacerated but alive. In any case, the ether filaments had not been harvested, and the group picked them up with great joy. Nevertheless, their passionate harvest had to stop abruptly, or else they too would be harvested in atrocious suffering. As the trees in the forest became more and more scattered, and the wild grasses were replaced by an eccentric translucent cyan sand, the group arrived at the foot of a slope a few meters high. Grew a war. A roar out of all proportion to anything they'd heard before, paralyzed them with terror. The trees were vibrating, the earth was shaking. Their violated eardrums began to bleed, a tinnitus sound adding to the surrounding cacophony. Panicked pigs were running towards them, terrified of what they had just encountered. Jake intercepted with his machete all the pigs that crossed his blade, despite his stupor. Considering the urgency, he sucked up the ether without concern for Amy and Will and rushed up the hill. What he saw there forever changed his view of the world, of which he was but an insignificant pawn. A few meters away, lying at his feet, the remains of a Kodiak bear, among the largest he had ever seen in a photo. Gutted from side to side, it had bled to death up to here, not without taking several digesters in death with it, as attested by the silvery blood-covered corpses. A few dozen meters further on, a similar bear emitted squeaks of agony, its front paws severed and a gaping wound in its lower abdomen revealing its intestines. It was doomed, but the real horror scene was 200 meters away, at the edge of the forest. A digester more massive than anything Jake had ever seen before. Almost 4 meters at the withers, 7 meters standing. The chitin on the hind legs now extended to the rest of the body, forming a surprisingly harmonious armor. A piece of chitin covered the monster's skull, forming a helmet very similar to the visored helmets of knights, except that here the visor struggled to hide the pulsating white light from the creature's 3 silvery eyes. The arms had split into a pair of sharp metal wings more than 10 meters wide, while the original arms had taken the form of a huge round shield and a blade as long as the creature. The metal tail resembled that of a mouse, but was now as long and thick as a boa and dragged along the ground behind the monster. From which alien species this digester was inspired to take this shape, Jake had no idea. In front of this abyssal creature was a titanic and completely rabid Kodiak bear. The bears lying in front of Jake, he understood, were her children, and he could have sworn that tears were streaming from the predatory mother's brown eyes. Such an emotion of sadness and anger. The giant bear seemed almost human. If the cubs were the size of a large adult bear, was it necessary to give the mother's measurements? Here they come anyway. 6 meters at the withers, 11 meters long, 10 tons at the very least. A singularly shiny brown fur, as if they were thin steel blades rather than hair. Sharp black claws 1/2 meter long and fangs in the same vein. With each roar, it spat out enough to fill a small bathtub. What did Jake do when he saw a scene like that out of a fantasy book? Nothing glorious. He threw himself to the ground on the other side of the field. The ether of the bear and the dead digesters hadn't been picked up, but he wasn't one of those who risked his life for a lost cause. Oh no. The huge digester wasn't alone. Other monsters, as big as those he had fought, were assisting it. 2 other frightened cubs were hiding in their mother's paws, but foolish would be the one to underestimate them. After all, one of them had torn the neck of a full-grown pig out of a mouthful anyway. God damn it. How long had those bears been on this planet? For a brief moment, hesitation almost made him lose his mind, but the gaze of a group of digesters in his direction acted as a perfect cold shower. Although he had gained confidence since his first fights, he knew his limits. To shoot one of these things down, neither his gun nor his machete was cut out for the role. It would require explosives or a much more powerful firearm than he had at his disposal. He always had his assault rifle warm in his pack, but that would not change anything. Just as he was about to head back down the slope, the status quo was broken when a digester sneaked between the mother bear's hind legs to bite the tendons of one of the cubs. A roar of rage covered the victim's squeak of suffering, and a second later, the guilty digester, a creature much larger than those he had defeated, was torn into 4 pieces by a claw of extreme violence. The torso, chitinous legs, and head flew off in 3 different directions, while the monster's hooves remained planted on the ground. When Jake saw this, he turned pale. Until now, he thought that a mammal this size would be slow, like the dinosaurs of old. He was wrong. That was without counting on the ether. The move was so fast, the air whistled during the attack, projecting a gust of wind that was perceptible from his hiding place. He could barely keep up with his eyes. The digester wannabe knight uttered a shrill, screeching cackling sound that rattled his eardrums in response to the bear's display of strength. A second later, the 2 enraged titans charged towards each other. Jake didn't stay to witness the fight of the century. He leapt down the slope, only to be caught up by a sound wave similar to 2 shells exploding against each other. Amy and Will, who hadn't moved since his last instruction, were so pale-looking and immobile that he wondered if they had died forgetting to breathe. There was no time to coddle them. "Let's get the fuck out of here," their improvised leader shouted out, sprinting around the battlefield without turning back. Don't stop if you want to live. Chapter 54 The Sciendeaser. Watching such a nervous Jake run away without turning around, Amy and Will's icy blood started boiling with adrenaline. If this muscle-bound, badly combed barbarian, who was cutting the digesters with a smile on his face, was scared, it meant that they absolutely didn't want to find out what was lurking at the top of the hill. The trio ran with all their might, Jake continuing to outrun them without a glance. After 15 minutes, he took a sharp turn and headed back to the red cube. A few minutes later, he reached the edge of the forest again, to enter without transition a desert of cyan and translucent grains of sand, the same ones they had previously discovered as they approached the limits of the deciduous forest. The desert was desperately arid, not conducive to the development of life. No trees, grasses, or cacti. No moisture or watering holes. Not even dunes or mounds to vary the landscape. The desert was uniformly flat and blue as far as the eye could see. From a distance, it looked like a calm sea, but it wasn't. An alien desert, in short. There was no such place on Earth. Under other circumstances, Jake would never have ventured into this dead end of sand, and would have searched for an alternative, even if it meant wasting time. Unfortunately, they didn't have that luxury. The deafening screams and shocks of the 2 giant monsters slyly reminded them that they weren't out of the woods yet, and that it would only take a few minutes for the winner to find them by tracking their scent. He looked one last time in the direction of the forest, drew a deep breath, and then took a determined step towards the unknown land. Will and Amy stared at each other hesitantly, and then with the motivational help of a shrill, louder cackling sound than the previous ones, set off in the shadow of the taciturn man to whom they owed their lives. Meanwhile, another group of survivors were struggling to adapt to this new world. The playboy held on tightly to his Colt, with only 5 bullets left. On their way back to the snowy hill, they had bumped into another group of digesters. Miraculously, it wasn't the same ones from the hypermarket that had ravaged their group, but creatures barely bigger than a big cat. They had recognizable batrachian gray skin and shared a passion for the shrill cackles of their older brothers. These monsters were 6-legged, with the same metal scythes acting as forelegs. Nevertheless, the similarity with their evolved version ended there. While their scythes were still as sharp as ever, these monsters moved much more awkwardly. They were slower, weaker, and much less durable. What a relief, when 1 bullet had been enough to bring them down. The playboy had then fired 2 more shots before he realized there were too many of these vermin. Despite the vulnerability of these new opponents, they had still opted to flee, even though they knew they wouldn't often have such good opportunities to harvest ether. It was not easy to change one's cowardly nature. During their escapade, The child's 40-year-old mother had been bitten in the hock by a digester that was faster than its fellow brethren. Loanna, one of the groupies, had also startled everyone when she screamed in pain behind them. Turning around, Kyle had caught a glimpse of the jaw of one of the monsters firmly hooked to her left hand as she shook it vigorously. Before anyone could come to her aid, the wretched beast had let go, not forgetting to take half of her fingers in the process. The pain had been so intense that she had barely managed to convince herself to continue running. However, she had held on, a commendable performance for someone who had only been running and depending on others to survive until now. The digesters had not chased them to the top of the hill. Should it be inferred that these creatures could not stand the cold? Or was it rather because this area was protected by the Oracle as a gathering place for novices landing on planet B842? There was no way to tell, and they didn't care. The playboy had only agreed to take a break after hurtling down the other side of the hill in the same direction the barbarian and the other two traders had taken, despite the pleas of the middle-aged woman. To her great surprise, the child had been surprisingly compliant, and Loanna, who was missing the fingers of one hand, was perfectly silent, although her countenance was corpse-like. The good news was that with their oracle devices, they were not lost along the way. As long as their desire to catch up with the other trio was clear, the oracle would show them a clear path to follow. Loanna was pale, covered in sweat, exhibiting advanced signs of anemia. Indeed, they had been running at full speed for almost 30 minutes, leaving a gaping wound untreated. This was without considering the fact that they hadn't eaten much since the morning of their arrival on B842 and spent most of their time walking or running for their lives. After having bandaged their wounds, they set off again, this time towards the red cube, hoping to meet their much-hoped-for savior again soon. And there they were. After more than 36 hours without sleep, Providence had heard their prayers, and a ruined farmhouse stood before them. A macabre scene unfolded before them. Hundreds of dead livestock, their blood and guts stretching as far as the eye could see. Scavenging raven-like birds pecked at the eyes of the larger mammals. Small felines and other rodents feasted while ignoring each other, unconcerned about the buzzing of flies or the stench of carrion. Despite their disgust, they were relieved. Their group was exhausted, with 2 wounded who needed to be disinfected. Loanna had a high fever and had slowed down the pace considerably over the last few kilometers. The only man still alive apart from Kyle, and Kyle himself had supported her for the rest of the distance, the intense effort adding to their fatigue. The child's mother was fine, but was primarily responsible for their slowness. Her injury was not that serious, but it was an inconvenience because of its location. The scabs reopened with the slightest movement, and this housewife had an extremely low tolerance for pain. Her son, in comparison, was an example of resolution and perseverance. He had followed the group without complaining once. Paradoxically, the weakest was one of the most resilient in the group, since children of this age had a lot of recess time at school, which they spent playing games that were demanding on the cardiovascular system, such as running, dodgeball, wolf play, and other team sports. The advent of augmented reality had also made video games a significant source of physical activity. Kyle was a great player himself, and maybe that's why he was doing so well, despite the fact that he had been burying his head in the sand for the past 4 months instead of preparing. For the record, they had also been attacked once by a lone rank 2 digester, which the playboy had managed to shoot down by wasting several bullets, hence his 3 remaining rounds of ammunition. For the time being, it was fair to say that they were lucky. If they hadn't been so miserable, he would almost have assumed that someone was taking out the monsters for them. How could he have known that his reasoning was so close to the truth? If they had traveled only a few hundred meters further west, they would have discovered a clearing covered with the remains of digesters dissected by Jake and his group. Somehow, someone had really killed the monsters for them, even though it had never been their goal. The playboy had hastened to absorb what little ether he could get. Sarah, the dominant blonde of the group, had still stolen 2 of his precious ether strands. The first, by snatching the loot of one of his cult's victims before he could access it, the second by her own means. When the digesters level 1 went after them, one of them jumped at her, but unlike Loanna, Sarah had the presence of mind to pick up a long stainless steel knife from the mall's kitchen counter. The monster had come to impale itself against her blade, offering its ether with a last gasp of regret. The dialogue was becoming increasingly tense between them, considering the fact that they were both notoriously selfish when their lives were at stake. And they both knew they were cast in the same mold, hence their obvious mistrust. If he pretended to forget his Colt on a piece of furniture, Sarah would have immediately grabbed it, even if it meant pointing the gun at Kyle to dissuade him from depriving her of it. Meanwhile, they had laid Loanna on the living room sofa after making sure the house was unoccupied. Sophie, Sarah, Kyle, and the other middle-aged man set out to find something to disinfect and bandage the wounds of the two injured ones. They soon became disenchanted. The farm had already been searched from top to bottom, and everything that could be of use had been looted. However, when they came down with nothing but a gloomy look on their faces, they discovered a large garbage bag full of supplies and utilities, with a message hastily written on a crumpled piece of paper. Sorry to the owners, we took the initiative to help ourselves. We've left enough to last a while in case you come back, or for other passing survivors. That was Amy's handwriting. Chapter 55 Moment of Respite. Praise the Lord. That message scribbled by Amy contained two pieces of great news. The food problem was solved, and they were moving in the right direction. Finding the barbarian did not please them much, but in view of the carnage on this farm, he did not skimp on getting his hands dirty, digesters or not. This bitch. The curvaceous blonde spat hatefully after reading the message herself. From the ravaged expression of the surviving group members, this swear word contained more remorse for oneself than real hatred for the blue-haired girl. When they emptied the bag, they found enough canned food for a week or two, enough to wash themselves, and other utilities such as tape, bandages, and dressings, but no medical disinfectants or medicines. There were, however, a few bottles of hard liquor which the previous survivors had not bothered to consider, and the pot-bellied man quickly spotted them, as one might expect of an alcoholic biding his time in hiding and getting drunk. Sophie, who was studying to be a nurse, did the bandaging. The housewife's wound was not that serious, but the one of Loanna was worrisome. Without immediate care, the wound had become infected and threatened to turn into gangrene. Gangrene fever was evidence of this, and sepsis was not far away. When she noticed this, the student in the infirmary's lips trembled before doing the right thing. She had gone to warm a sharp kitchen knife to red before returning and asking the two men to hold the wounded woman, who had lost consciousness. A moment later, she had reopened the wounds, removing the infected muscle and bone pieces with a knife before cauterizing them with the burning blade. Unfortunately, they didn't have any antibiotics. Of course, Loanna's sleep was not so deep that her subconscious could ignore such stimuli. She had suddenly opened her eyes before she began to scream as she struggled, the two men in the group barely managing to hold her in place. A few minutes later, she slept sound asleep again, the pain being such that she had slipped back into unconsciousness. Finally quiet and safe, almost everyone squatted in one of the rooms upstairs to take a nap, of course after filling their bellies. To catch up with Jake's group, and for fear of sleeping in the woods, they had walked and run for over 36 hours and were at the end of their strength. They all needed sleep. Without the ether-rich atmosphere of B842, they would never have lasted that long. They had also all used their unique red crystal to gain some strength instead of saving it for the head tax of an Oracle City, as they had candidly hoped at first. If they had known that the people they were looking for were still there less than an hour earlier, they might even have continued on their way to reach them. Indeed, if Jake was setting a good pace for Will and Amy, he wasn't afraid to sleep under the stars, digesters on their heels or not. As a result, they had enjoyed a good night's sleep, giving Kyle's group a chance to catch up with them. This was obviously before their ether session. Catching up with them would be a lot harder now. Despite his flippant demeanor, the playboy wasn't an idiot. He knew that if in a few hours Loanna was not back on her feet, they would have to abandon her. It was their only chance if he wanted to catch up with the group of survivors that had gone before them. While everyone was sleeping and he was rummaging among the supplies left by the previous tenants, he discovered by chance a small bottle filled with a silvery liquid, accompanied by a second message they had not noticed. At first he had thought it was a special glue or car paint, something like that. Digesters blood. Speeds healing by applying ointment to wounds. Invigorates and speeds up recovery/regeneration by drinking it. May improve long-term ether statistics if consumed regularly. Indeed, at the last moment, Jake had considered the hypothesis that other survivors might follow in their footsteps and had decided to organize the food they could not carry and leave a single bottle of silver blood, explaining its uses. He already had more than enough on him and could not carry more without affecting his mobility. Well, he could, but honestly, since their arrival there were rather too many digesters around them than too few. The fact that digester's blood could be used as a healing ointment was Jake's latest discovery, after he voluntarily cut himself to test this possibility. Reading this, the playboy's heart leapt. He was convinced it was the handwriting of the shaggy-haired barbarian. He remembered seeing him drinking this silvery mixture on the snow-covered hilltop. At the time, he had found it repulsive, but now he understood that the savage knew what he was doing. Even if he was in ignorance before, he had to be willing to give up his preconceived ideas and his habits as a gourmet city dweller if he wanted to cope on his own. Uncorking the bottle, he plucked up his courage with both hands and after a deep breath took a sip of the beverage. Contrary to the foul taste he was expecting, a slightly sweet flavor excited his taste buds. The metallic smell of blood was present, but unlike the red blood of the animals of the earth, it did not cause the same reflex of disgust. Like a good wine, the liquid warmed his entrails, except that this invigorating heat extended to the entire body. His fatigue was not completely gone, but he was already feeling better, more full than with the can of lentils he had swallowed. Decisively, he went to the foot of the sofa on which Loanna was resting, undid her bandages, and smeared the wound with silver blood, then forced Loanna's lips to open to pour a few sips of the potion. Half of the liquid dripped down next door, but the rest arrived safely. For a few minutes nothing happened. Then the remedy took action. Loanna stopped sweating, and her pretty face started to turn color again. The almost stump-formed crusts on the wounds cauterized with red iron. Kyle forced her to drink again, before falling asleep on the next chair, not without having set the alarm on his smartphone for 7 o'clock. Less than 3 hours of sleep, and the guarantee of being exposed to all sorts of unpredictable dangers when walking in the woods at night. But that was the price they had to pay if they wanted to catch up with the other survivors. Incidentally, this gesture betrayed his lack of interest in his oracle bracelet, since Jake had long since given his smartphone to eat to his own device to make it perform these functions. When his alarm went off 3 hours later, Kyle woke up with a start, feeling as if he had barely closed his eyes. Even so, he felt perfectly alert. In front of him, Loanna stared at him, visibly surprised to see her wounds so well cicatrized. Unfortunately, her fingers were still missing. He himself had not believed for a second that Digester's blood could completely regenerate her hand. Even the best remedies had their limits. "How do you feel, Loanna?" the playboy asked calmly. "Well, if you ignore the fact that I have no left hand and that I'm left-handed," the young woman grunted, trying to smile, but tears flowed instead. For tact it was a failure, but there was no time to spare her. "I'll wake the others. We leave in 5 minutes." Kyle informed her while stretching. "Pick up what you can carry by putting it in one of the backpacks we found in the kitchen." "All right." The pot-bellied man had to be kicked a few times to wake him up, but in general everyone prepared without grumbling. With the backpacks they had picked up at the mall and those they had found in the house, they finally had enough to carry food. It was obvious that the playboy jealously kept the silver blood bottle in his own backpack, after having briefly explained Loanna's miraculous recovery. This made Sarah flinch, but since she had chosen to go to sleep rather than inspect the food, she could only blame herself. Leaving the farm to resume their journey to the trio, they once again contemplated the animals slaughtered in the pens to their great displeasure. Barely 2 miles away, there was some change. A corpse of a pig right in front of them, forcing them to take a shamefully longed-for break. Half of the neck was missing, as well as the animal's hindquarters, but boot tracks indicated that the trio of survivors they were tracking had gone in that direction. This was the first time they had noticed human footprints since leaving the farm. It was a miracle with the lack of light that they had not drifted in another direction. Excited by the knowledge that they were on the right path, they set off again with more spirit. Even the housewife, who often complained, bent to the imposed rhythm. She had noticed that the boot prints were quite far apart, indicating a running stride. The trio they were chasing had lost no time. It was amazing that the nerd and the silent girl with the blue highlights had kept up such a pace so far. They must have been at least as exhausted as they were. Unlike Jake's group, their pace was noticeably slower despite their renewed determination. and it took them a good part of the night to get through the 40 kilometers or so that had taken the trio only 4.5 hours without tiring more than that. Chapter 56, only 6 left. Kyle's group couldn't say the same thing. After a forced march in the middle of the night, with a significant sleep debt, without the help of additional ether and the knowledge of the revitalizing properties of Digester's blood, they were clearly suffering. The child was mute from the start, and that he was not well was obvious. He was taking it upon himself, like all of them. Exhaustion forced them to take more and more frequent breaks, and the lack of visibility turned every shadow into a frightening monster, adding palpable mental tension to the fatigue already present. From this point on, they rediscovered the remains of the wounded pigs that Jake had finished, as well as the Digester's much more frightening paw prints. The pot-bellied man advised them to stop there while they still could, the trio being surely dead and digested by now. Kyle ignored him and hit the road again, clutching his Colt tightly. The rest of the group followed in silence. The only good news was that they were getting closer to their goal, and at only 4:30 in the morning, the sun was already rising. Kyle had stopped ignoring his bracelet after treating Loanna. The status tab was vital, as was the mapping function, which summarized the distance they had traveled. Each tab and function was undoubtedly extremely important to survive peacefully on beat 842, and he would try to take care of these as soon as he would feel up to it. At last, at 5 a.m., with the chilly air and the dawn sun well established in the purple sky, they reached the same steep ground bearing that blocked Jake's progress. More dead pigs, but otherwise silence. If they had been paying the slightest bit of attention, they would have noticed that only one of the 3 pairs of boot prints had climbed the slope, and that the same boot prints had just as quickly hurtled their way down to flee in another direction, with the other 2 pairs of prints on their heels. Unaware of the danger, they entered the slope without suspecting anything. At the top, a breathtaking sight. Dead digesters as far as the eye could see, the corpse of 2 huge bears, and in the distance a big weird rock. A feast of ether free for consumption. The blood of the group did only one turn before freezing, but not for the same reasons. The playboy was delighted with such a buffet, but couldn't help feeling a kind of inexplicable apprehension, holding him back from rushing. Sarah felt the same anxiety that could not be allayed. This was not the case with the pot-bellied man. Glory smiled upon the fastest. Knowing that such a chance would not come again soon, he rushed forward, realizing the dash of his life, propelled by his greed. He swallowed all the ether in front of the stunned gaze of the rest of the group, without even using his bracelet. With no competition, he went from one body to the next, feeling himself becoming more powerful than he had ever been. As he became stronger and more enduring than he had ever been, his psyche continued to distort itself. His tiredness vanished, his arthritis? A bad memory. The excitement increasingly irrepressible, and his mental state totally under the grip of the memories contained by the ether of the deceased, he ventured further and further, until he reached the feet of the rock. If he didn't have the morning sun right in his eyes, he could have realized before it was too late what the bright contrast was hiding from him. Falling on a 3rd bear corpse, he burst out laughing before collecting his due diligently. Turning around briefly to taunt the rest of the group who had not moved, he was galvanized to see them mutated in stupor. So stunned, in fact, that their lower lips trembled, their faces were pale and sweaty. The kid with the Colt and the blonde bitch were so disgusted by his attitude that they were slowly but surely going down the slope backwards, as if to tell him that they were letting him savor his victory for this time, but that they would keep an eye on him. Only when the rest of the group began to adopt the same behavior, including the child, did he begin to think that something was wrong. His oracle device was also raining down a cloud of warning notifications on him. Strange, they seem to be afraid of me, he noticed during a flash of rare lucidity. When the rest of the group started to run and disappeared from his sight, he began to worry, but didn't get offended. They abandoned him. Nevertheless, loneliness had always been the price to pay for those at the top, and he fully accepted the consequences of his actions. He just had to. A viscous liquid ran down his smooth scalp. A hot breath smelling of rotting meat swept over his body, making his clothes hum. Even a jerk like him, who was particularly slow on the uptake, could activate his brain when the situation demanded it. He understood everything. And when he understood, He defecated all over himself while all the sphincters in his body relaxed at the same time and his nervous system abandoned him. Trembling and sobbing, chanting, "Mercy, God have mercy on this miserable sinner." Barely audible, he slowly raised his head. These were his last words. For a fraction of a second, he saw a huge tongue and translucent fangs covered with coagulated silvery blood. Then it was nothingness. At the same time, the playboy was running for his life, not caring whether the rest of the group followed or not. This terror, the digesters, terrified him, but never in his life had he felt such despair. He would forever thank his parents for giving him such heightened senses. He had first recorded the presence of the strange rock without paying attention to it. Then, with his growing apprehension, he had focused all his attention on it, ignoring the masses of ether and the fool rushing at them. When the idiot had approached the mound of unknown nature, his brain had finished deciphering those shapes, allowing him to ignore the contrast created by the sunlight. At that moment, the rock had moved. A bear bigger than a dinosaur. Its fur was coated with red and silver dried blood, creating a symphony of motley colors with the pronounced brown of its hair scarcely dominating. On the part of the rock that remained inert, a titanic digester corpse, covered with shattered chitin armor, his body broken as if it had fallen from a mountain several thousand meters high. The bear and the digester had fought to the death, and the bear had prevailed. 1 point for the mammals of the earth. Hooray! Kyle had fled immediately, scampering off like a hare in front of a tiger, following the same path as Jake and his two companions in a very similar situation. Sarah was on his heels, and the rest followed a few dozen meters behind. Gruer. His heart stopped beating. The potbelly man was dead. Serves this envious jerk right. Only 6 left. A despicable thought came over him. Only 5 more sacrifices so that he could live. He hated himself for thinking like that, but his life was worth more than any of these people. For his family, he would have shown more self-sacrifice, but not for strangers or convenience friends. Even the groupies who followed him shared a similar mentality. He had the colt, luckily for him, running with nothing to worry about but breathing. He didn't realize that the sun was high in the sky now, that trees were becoming scarce, and that translucent cyan sand had replaced grass and mud. At breakfast time in the morning, they reached the edge of the deciduous forest and discovered a blue desert stretching to infinity. 3 pairs of recognizable boot prints formed a trail that disappeared where the horizon merged. He stared at each surviving member of his group for a long time, his gaze stopping almost hypnotically on Sarah and she on his own. They were exhausted. They had only a few days of food, and an arid desert lay before them. But it was desert or forest, and the forest meant digesters and giant bears. With his decision made, he walked in Jake's footsteps, hoping to find the trio again very soon, and that this new day would offer a better alternative to their hell. Chapter 57 Reunion. The balls of incandescent light, which did not respect any of the rules of gravity and which acted as suns, blinded the trio. The rays of light were reflected and diffracted by the natural prisms that formed certain grains of translucent sand, making any attempt at orientation difficult. Multiple rainbows were imprinted on their retinas, causing a strange sensation of drunkenness and psychic torture at the same time. This was reminiscent of the sensory deprivation protocols used in experiments of dubious ethics, which had proved that only a few days were enough to turn a healthy man into a vegetable. Fortunately, Jake was at the helm of the ship, wearing his new sunglasses, which he had miraculously taken out of his pack, which had become a veritable wonder box in the eyes of Amy and Will. They were content to follow his reassuring shadow, praying that they would soon be able to leave this desolate place. Amy also had a pair of sunglasses with her when she arrived on planet B842, which she had unfortunately quickly lost in her frantic flight to survive within minutes of being transported here. The good news was that it was neither too hot nor too cold. One might have expected a scorching heat in a desert with no water holes or clouds, but it was not. The sun's caress was barely warm, and a gentle breeze from the direction of the red cube to which they were heading made the walk very bearable. In fact, anything was more comfortable than running out of breath, dirty and sweaty in order to escape from digesters eager to devour them. Which brought us to a second piece of good news. No digesters, or anything alive yet to be seen by them. In fact, a real breath of fresh hope, given their circumstances. Neither of these monsters had followed them into the desert, and the two colossal creatures were already a bad memory. Even so, Jake remained confident. Many animals would choose the comfort and abundance of the forest, rather than venturing into a barren and unknown desert for a prey or two that was a little too persistent. According to his oracle, it was past noon. He intended to advance at least until nightfall. Firstly, because he hoped to get out of this desert as quickly as possible, their food and water resources being limited. And secondly, because he didn't know how night temperatures behaved in this desert. Even in the deserts on Earth, temperatures at night could approach 0 degrees despite the stifling heat that was barely bearable in the daytime. Considering the pleasant caress of the sun at what was supposed to be the hottest hour of the day, it was better not to be there yet to discover it. After a short break, during which the group took the opportunity to quench their thirst and have a snack, the trio set off again. Amy and Will had been extremely cooperative since he had given them his opinion on the situation. Not that it made much difference in the end, since with or without them, his decision would have been the same. As they progressed, the group began to get restless, trotting around in the late afternoon to gain time. The sea of cyan sand was still stretching endlessly towards the horizon, and even Jake was showing signs of nervousness. He had already decided to spend the night in the desert. He was keeping his fingers crossed that his theory was wrong, or they were likely to spend a very bad night. If they were now stronger and more resilient than before, there was a limit to how much their bodies could withstand. The heat still made them sweat, and the cold still made them shiver. The gain in strength and constitution had indeed changed things, but it was not enough. With a source of wood, they could have considered making a fire, but no vegetable eminence deigned to show them his presence. Eventually night fell, and the gloomy Jake decided to set up camp. They quickly set up the tent they had borrowed, not without difficulty. If Jake hadn't learned how to set up a tent in the last few months, they would have wasted a considerable amount of time. His instincts had not deceived him, and as soon as the twilight suns disappeared, a silver moon replaced them, accompanied by a sharp drop in temperature. Very similar to the Earth's, this moon, by the way. Perhaps it had also been absorbed here along with them. The question that now arose was, where had the purple moons gone? The changing climates and landscapes from one area to another, as well as the changing sky, made orientation using the sun or stars impossible. The oracle device was absolutely indispensable. The breeze that gently cooled them a few minutes before turned into an icy bite, freezing their bones. With no combustibles, they could only huddle together, wrapped in the sleeping bags and coats they had in their packs. From time to time, they would chew strips of dried digester meat. Although this did not cure them of the cold, it circulated a pleasant, invigorating warmth radiating from their stomachs that kept them going. Eventually, however, the night passed, and they survived. Jake, seized by boredom, even came to analyze the translucent sand under their feet, only to stupidly realize that it was actually salt. A colored salt, but salt anyway. Despite the icy breeze, the grains remained warm and comforting. In the absence of other life forms, this salt logically absorbed all the surrounding ether in the atmosphere. On this hazardous idea, he decided to take a few samples. Naturally, he tasted the salt. It tasted like salt, no doubt about it. But there was something more. As common salt was essentially sodium chloride, it was necessary to provide potassium in equivalent quantities through a diversified diet, rich enough in vegetables, as these two minerals worked in tandem. The high blood pressure problems of our modern societies were precisely the consequence of such an imbalance, as sodium promotes extracellular water retention and a number of other vital functions. No problem with this salt. A strange miracle of nature. A perfect ratio of potassium and sodium, combined with a host of other equally important minerals like magnesium and calcium in the right proportions, all perfectly bioavailable. Many dietary supplements in particular boasted of satisfying our vital needs in minerals or vitamins, but sometimes suffered from poor bioavailability or on the contrary were overdosed, making them practically ineffective, even dangerous. No impact on ether stats as with pink potato or digestive meat on the other hand. They couldn't always have it all. It was possible, however, that with more time, this salt would end up turning into something else by absorbing energy from the surrounding atmosphere, eventually obtaining properties that it did not yet have. When the suns rose, The temperatures rose again, and the warmth of the day magically returned in a few minutes. They lazily dismantled their tent, swallowed their umpteenth slice of meat and cup of digester's blood before setting off again without conviction. The night cold had taken its toll on their exhausted bodies. None of the members of the trio had managed to sleep soundly. The slightest movement caused a horrible draft to circulate between them, which immediately awakened the other two members of the group. After a while, no one dared to move, and so their chances of recovery from their forced march disappeared. There was, however, another group of survivors not far from them in much worse condition. Really not far from them. No sooner were they ready to leave than they heard screams. Their senses, heightened by the heavy silence of the desert, immediately captured these new sounds, causing the trio to suddenly turn around. Nearly a kilometer away, the silhouette of 6 disheveled humanoid shadows staggered painfully in their direction. The shouts came from female voices and a male voice that Jake identified as the Playboys. Their voices were raspy, almost aphonic. Seeing this, the trio put their things down and waited patiently. It took a good 30 minutes for the group of survivors to join them, under the frustrated gaze of Jake, dissatisfied with wasting his precious time. Yet, when they were discovered to be disoriented and exhausted, even a loner like Jake felt a sense of pity. You only had to know how to count to notice that there were fewer of them than when they separated at the top of the snowy hill. They must have had some unfortunate encounters. What a shrewd deduction, Sherlock. She commented sarcastically. Thanks. I amaze myself sometimes. When they finally arrived in front of their camp, they stopped not knowing what to say or do. Even the child remained frozen in place, like a soldier standing at attention. After a while, the Playboy broke the ice after clearing his throat. Can we travel with you? Chapter 58 Water. Can we travel with you? Kyle asked in a neutral voice, but with eyes begging. It had been a long time since he had lost his arrogance and attention-seeking illusions. Sarah, his longtime sex friend, terrified him so much that he didn't dare take his eyes off her for a moment for fear that she would knock him out in his sleep and steal his colt. To survive, he had to swallow his pride. Jake stared at him for a long time without saying anything. Amy and Will didn't say a word either. They felt a mixture of embarrassment and pity when they saw the pitiful state of their old and brief traveling companions. But that was the end of it. By choosing to abandon them, they knew in their hearts that this group was doomed. The mere fact that they had not been completely eradicated came as a surprise to both of them. After all, not everyone had a bloodthirsty warrior capable of wiping out a squad of digesters single-handedly. A squad of digesters like the one they faced on their first night on planet B-842 would have been enough to eliminate them 10 times over. So they were lucky. If Amy's former co-workers could hear her thoughts, they'd probably vomit blood, including Kyle. Luckily, they were completely oblivious to all those morbid thoughts. Only extreme fatigue and the faint hope that Jake would take them under his wing kept them from collapsing. After a few seconds that seemed interminable to the 6 lethargic survivors, Jake answered. You can. The shaggy, bearded man, whose eagle eyes terrified them, then gave a decisive look to Will and Amy, who understood the message immediately. After 2 days of traveling with the taciturn hermit, the duo was slowly getting used to his expressions and gestures. Their leader wasn't very talkative, but each of his moves had a meaning they'd be foolish to ignore. The trio picked up their things and set off again. Amy, still feeling a certain affinity with her recent, but superficial friends, fell behind Jake and Will in explaining the rules of their group. I will not apologize for leaving. Amy cut Sarah off as she saw her mouth opening. Just looking at you is enough to make me feel good about my decision. If you want to take it out on someone, take it out on your own lack of lucidity. Hearing this, Kyle felt the red of shame rise in his face, but he remained silent. Indeed, his group had followed him, thinking of his colt and his comely appearance more reassuring than that of the silent barbarian in front. They could only blame themselves. His shame came from the fact that, at that moment, he had felt important, worthy of this attention, thinking he was the perfect person to lead this group. Yet he had experienced the strength of the latter firsthand and could have chosen to join him. But his ego had gotten involved, and he had put his life and that of his group in danger. Sarah's face was singing a symphony of very different emotions. Far from being red with shame, She displayed the supreme and disdainful arrogance of a woman expressing her contempt for an inferior being. "You bitch," the luscious blonde cursed, spitting out all her venom. "I'm the reason you've made some friends. If it wasn't for us, you'd still be all alone in your nerd orphan hole. You abandoned us without embarrassment, and even now you're still behaving like the bitch you are." Amy was left speechless, letting her former friend pour out her rage and hatred, all with a spitting rain far from the elegance usually displayed by this sexy blonde. There was indeed a time for everything, and certain shocks often revealed a person's best or worst. It wasn't hard to determine which part of Sarah's personality had been revealed. When she finally ran out of breath after shouting angrily, which happened very quickly given how tired they were, Amy spoke again. "I don't care what you think. I chose to live, you chose your own path. I'm only speaking with you to inform you of the rules in our group. Rule number 1, anything Jake says is law. Second rule, don't slow Jake down. He's the leader of the group, but in truth he isn't leading us, we're following him. He doesn't need us to survive, we need him. Do I make myself clear?" The 6 survivors stared at her blankly, their lower jaws falling on their shoes. Never would they have believed that the shy Amy could show such assurance and authority. Even Sarah kept her trap shut for once. "Very clear," Kyle confirmed, thinking deep down inside that it was better than he thought. Basically, as long as he could keep up with the barbarian, whose name was Jake, he had a chance to survive. Soon, however, he spotted a few subtleties in Amy's lyrics. "If we just follow him, how does it go with food, water, or ether?" Kyle had, of course, noticed the weird sabers Amy and Will were carrying. "Of course, you'll have to figure it out." The young woman with the blue strands replied with a cheerful smile. "If there's more food than he can carry, you're free to help yourself, and as for the ether, you'll have only what you've killed yourself." I will use his exact words. "If time permits, he can teach you how to fish, but he'll never give you fish." In other words, we are in an arid salt desert right now, and the only water and food we have is the one in our backpacks. Until we leave this place or secure a sustainable source of food, don't even think about asking him to share his food. Clearly, he wants to get to the red cube as soon as possible, and his life is a priority. We are not his friends, minions, or servants. We are the vultures that fly in the wake of a predator to feed on the carrion he does not deign to eat. After this tirade, there was a moment of hesitation, then an admiring whistle from Sophie, the brown nurse with UV-charred skin, broke the silence. Who knew little Amy had such eloquence? She exclaimed in shock. Until then, she had thought that this girl was a bit off in the head. Amy smiled slightly in spite of herself, then forced herself to find her poker face, but failed, eventually unable to keep her fake tough attitude. Faced with her failure, she turned around and trotted a quick step to join Jake and Will in the lead. Too stunned or too tired to complain, the 6 survivors walked back on her heels. They were soon disillusioned. If the barbarian was more convenient than they had imagined, there was a sad counterpart to that. He wouldn't wait for them. Yet none of them had slept that night for the sole purpose of catching up with them. Combined with the previous sleepless night, they had only had a few hours nap in 2 days. The average human showed signs impossible to ignore after 36 hours of sleep deprivation, and several days were necessary to make up for this lack, even with sufficient rest. This meant that their condition would worsen significantly further by the end of the day, and they would have to maintain the same intensity for as long as Jake felt able to do so. This was a real problem, as he was walking as fast as they were running, and his every step was swallowing up the distance in an alarming way. If they knew that Jake had already taken pity on them, slowing down significantly from the pace they had planned at the start, they would probably have fainted. Sometimes, ignorance was a blessing, and with the conviction that they were safe, they persevered, pushing their limits. As the day progressed, the 6 survivors were frequently heard emptying the contents of their flasks and bottles in big gulps. Will politely advised them to save their water, but when his recommendation was ignored, he shrugged his shoulders and simply moved forward without looking back. "Let them," Jake said when Will returned to his side. "They need to learn on their own. I'm especially worried about the child, who is not responsible for anything. His condition worries me." Indeed, the boy's complexion was pale, he was dragging his feet behind the group and hadn't been sweating for some time. While the lifestyle of the last 2 days was certainly strenuous for healthy adults, it was absolutely detrimental to a growing child. If he did not stabilize his situation quickly, his health would pay the consequences irreversibly. Isn't there something we can do for him? Amy asked, joining in their conversation. She too felt sorry for the kid. There is. Jake replied in an indifferent tone. But he's not the problem in this group. He doesn't waste his water, and his mother is also suffering trying to save hers for her son. It's the others who are going to get us into trouble sooner or later. I estimate that if we don't get out of this desert in 3 days, they will run out of water. We are not much better off than they are. But with our stamina and this temperature, you will only suffer from dehydration after 3 days without water, about a week before our situation becomes an emergency if we ration. A little more if we drink our urine. Of course, all this is only true if we keep this pace. Under the best conditions, you can easily last about 10 days if you don't have an electrolyte imbalance. Official record, 18 days for the curious. Amy and Will made faces when they heard him talk about drinking their urine, but it was a fact that they were in much better shape than the other group. 1. They had absorbed a good amount of ether. 2. They had eaten and drunk digester meat and blood, which were extremely nutritious. And finally, they had been able to rest the night before, if not sleep well. If they felt thirsty like everyone else, a few sips were enough to calm them down, and it had to be said that they did not sweat as much, thus wasting less water. In the end, Jake's estimates were only estimates. Even a normal human could in some circumstances go up to 4 days without water, although 2 was a more reliable benchmark. Moreover, even without water, they were left with the water contained in the food, juices, and sauces in the canned food they had taken with them. In the end, the situation was not so bad. The important thing was to get out of the desert quickly, and according to his deductions, the red cube was close. Chapter 59, The Red Cube. Despite their high water consumption and general exhaustion, Jake wasn't worried at all. Aslael had guaranteed the presence of an oracle city within 200 kilometers of the snow-covered hill. These cities also contained at least one red cube. If his oracle device had given him this path to follow, it was at least guaranteed that the red cube they were heading towards was closer. Since leaving the snowy hill, they had traveled more than 100 kilometers, and therefore were at least halfway there. Unfortunately, the Playboy group couldn't care less about these details. Having spent a sleepless night in the hope of catching them, in addition to having covered a greater distance, they also had a significant sleep debt. This translated into a bad mood and general tension, as well as a readiness to go off at the drop of a hat. Kyle was too scared of Jake to complain, but Sarah wasn't one to mince her words and had decided to spit out all of her verve at every opportunity. However, she quickly abandoned this losing strategy. Jake had neither the social skills nor the patience to deal with the mood swings and demands of the opposite sex. As a result, he stuck to his principles and simply put on a pair of earplugs and then stepped up the pace. Naturally, he removed the earplugs shortly afterwards to preserve his hearing, but the message had been delivered. After that, Sarah brooded for a while, before suddenly changing her approach after watching Amy. If bitching didn't work, she could try a more subtle approach instead. If there was one thing Sarah was confident about, it was her looks. This proud and haughty woman was a beautiful blonde with flattering measurements. Her body was voluptuous and curvy in all the right places, and her facial features were fine and delicate. She also had beautiful almond-shaped eyes as deep blue as the ocean, and the way she nibbled her luscious lips invited depravity. Unlike Sophie, she had a natural tan and flawless skin. Overall, her self-confidence was not unfounded. She turned men's heads, and she knew it. If she was wearing a blouse or shirt instead of a simple top, she probably would have unbuttoned 1 or 2 buttons on her cleavage to highlight her voluminous assets. However, the walk was intensive enough to make such ambitions impossible to achieve. The decisive moment would come at nightfall, when Jake would decide it was time to set up camp. If his plan worked as planned, she would patiently trick him into being vulnerable but tactile, understanding, and passionate. It worked every time. Even men of power were not insensitive to the charms of a woman like her. If Jake had an abnormally high IQ, Sarah compensated with an excellent emotional quotient. She always got her way, and there were no moral taboos restricting her thinking. Not this time. As the suns began their slow descent towards the horizon, the desert cyan, repetitive and silent until now, finally showed change. It began with a raven cawing in the sky above them that startled them all. Then, other birds of various shapes and colors flew above them at full speed. Then a few minutes later, Jake noticed some weird shapes snaking through the sand salt and heading in the same direction. The same direction they were going to. The red cube. This cheered Jake up, since it meant it wasn't as far away as he thought it would be. A shame not everyone shared his opinion. Most of them were worried about this gathering of animals of all kinds, and thought it was best to keep their distance. Jake finally took the decision of slowing down so that they wouldn't be surrounded without his knowledge. The rest of the group enthusiastically welcomed this brief respite, especially the boy's mother who had been suffering from her poor physical condition all along. During the next hour, their group came across more and more animals and alien creatures of all kinds. Birds, bugs as big as Labradors, elephants, a pride of lions, a solitary tiger, chamois, and other alien creatures with much more random morphologies. Their most notable encounter was a kind of translucent moray eel snaking and floating in the air and flickering an orange light like a gigantic firefly. The creature ignored them from beginning to end, but the fact that none of them understood the phenomenon by which it was moving made them extremely uncomfortable. By the time the suns were almost down and the purple moons replaced them yet again, the twilight sky tinted with a mixture of red and purple, they were but one group among many. In front of them, a few hundred yards away, stood an impressive sand salt dune, and Jake was convinced that the red cube was just behind it. With a little more effort, they would finally reach their destination. This time, the lonely lout was not the only one who was eager to find out what could attract so many people of so many different species and races. Calmly, the group ascended the dune, saving their breath in case of an unpleasant surprise. When they finally reached the top, the spectacle they witnessed astounded them on the spot, Jake included. Hundreds of thousands of life forms huddled around a titanic red cube, covering the desert to the horizon. The red cube was aptly named. More than 100 meters high, pulsating with intense blood-colored light to the beating rhythm of a human heartbeat, this incongruous structure stood out in the middle of the Cyan Desert. It was an impressive structure composed of energy, and simply by appearance, it was impossible to determine whether this giant parallelepiped had a solid consistency or was simply a mass of energy. Glancing cautiously but threateningly at the surrounding groups, Jake drew his machete and semi-automatic pistol before cautiously entering the crowd. The rest of his group, never having been very brave, followed in his footsteps. Amy and Sarah in particular were right behind him, determined not to be left behind. The playboy, for his part, remained silent, but at the way he squeezed the handle of his Colt, one could easily guess his discomfort. Loanna, Sophie, and the others were no braver, and the first male looks other than those of the men in their group did not bring them the relief they had hoped for. Around the red cube, in addition to the many alien and animal factions, there was obviously a section occupied by humanoid species, including humans from Earth. Obviously, this was the direction Jake chose to go first. He may have been antisocial, but sitting between two hyenas and a kind of three-legged minotaur twice his size and covered in scales was not very appealing to him. Far from being reassured, the situation around them could not be more hostile. There were several hundred humans around them. Half of them were wearing similar clothes, and their skin color ranged from pale white to the black typical of Central African populations. Earthlings. The other half did not speak any language they recognized, and their morphologies and clothing styles differed markedly. In general, Jake counted at least 3 different species of the Homo genus, including Terrians. A first gathering of about 40 people consisted of muddy-skinned humans dressed in animal skins and primitive loincloths. The males were enormous masses of walking muscles, at least 8 feet tall, while the females were more slender, often topless, and generally frielier than Earth women. The men were more or less armed with clubs, assegais, and spears, made of wood, hemp yarn, and stones. Some women were equipped with slings or knives made of bone or stone. Their faces were similar to those of the Earthlings except that they had slit pupils, and their hair was a fluorescent light blue, just like their irises. Jake's first hypothesis was that they lived on a planet with a poorly lit environment where these attributes had a role in courting or defining their social position. Aside from his customary mistrust, Jake would not have been bothered more than that if 5 of the more feeble but well-endowed females in the group were not being raped through every orifice in some sort of giant gangbang. Contemplating men built like tanks violating in groups of 3, females almost a meter shorter than them had something profoundly sickening about it. Amy, Sarah, Loanna, and Sophie were aghast, but unable to take their eyes off it, while the 40-year-old mother did her best to hide this traumatic vision to her son. It was the gaze of some of these bullies that had awakened their insecurities. The group of Earthlings were no more reassuring. Society had degenerated on Earth in recent months to the point where very few people still dared to leave their homes in the end, leaving delinquents and criminals to flourish. It was paradoxically these same criminals who often made the best use of their oracle devices. The consequences were obvious. Of this group of more than 100 people, about 30 men armed to the teeth had taken total control of the group, making life difficult for the other men under their thumb and treating the women like slaves. In view of the ecchymoses, black eyes, burns, and lacerations of all sorts, to join them would be a condemnation for the women of their group. The leaders were currently watching with a lustful air the orgy taking place in the previous group, the most indecent ones masturbating openly in full view of all. The third group, the most numerous, was different. These humans were similar in size to those on Earth, but seemed to come from a world technologically midway between that of the first and second groups. About 50 men, making up about 1/3 of their total number, were arranged in an orderly circle around their encampment, wearing medieval armor and chainmail. Their belts were fitted with gladiuses or long swords, and some of them carried halberds or crossbows. Another third of the mixed group were cowardly and dressed in rags or coarsely sewn woolen or linen garments. Civilians, peasants, or traders from a lower social class. The last third was protected by another group of guards in more prestigious armor decorated with gold lines. A coat of arms representing a sort of symmetrical double crescent moon, joined by their edges, was painted on their breastplates and shields. Among this last third, a small group of nobles, including a few splendid young women wearing long dresses and imposing tiaras embedded with precious gemstones, were gazing outraged at the barbarians indulging in their gang-banging, without any sense of prudishness. Chapter 60 Bang. If one were to notice a major difference from the Earth humans in this third group, it would have been that their skin shone as if it were covered with golden glitter. This gave a certain aura of grandiloquence to even the poorest caste. As for the aristocrats, they seemed to be directly inspired by a Greek or Scandinavian pantheon. Even according to strict aesthetic criteria, no member of this people could be described as ugly. Their hair was unusually colored, seeming to follow no particular evolutionary logic. 2 young women at the center of the formation, wearing long poppy red satin dresses, proudly wore long pale pink hair that Jake had so far only seen in manga or movies. Other nobles seeking their attention had equally zany hair colors and cuts, ranging from pale green to dark purple. Each of them displayed undisguised arrogance, as if they considered their race superior to all others. Despite their apparent contempt, the security perimeter put in place was clearly defensive in nature, with no intention of encroaching on the territory of other human or humanoid factions, nor offending anyone. Apart from these 3 human groups with distinct physical characteristics, there were a large number of humanoid factions, some of which were far more numerous. Troll creatures 6 meters high, giants covered in suckers with tentacles for hair, scaled minotaurs, a people resembling what the T-Rex might have become if they had evolved into a humanoid form. There were also those humanoid creatures that looked like humans, but on closer inspection, they turned out to be of a completely different origin. One of these extraterrestrial species communicated with some sort of disharmonious rattling from some unknown appendage, while their bodies looked like knights in full armor, except that these were plates of chitin which could not be removed. There were also all these humanoid species evolved from animals, many of which existed on Earth. Jake's theory was that on habitable exoplanets, and provided their DNA was carbon-based, there was only a finite number of possible variations. A cat identical to Crunch didn't necessarily exist on another planet, but a group of species with feline-like characteristics? Without a doubt. As for all those theoretical life forms that needed completely different environments to survive, obviously they had probably been shipped to a completely different area. Concluding that the best strategy consisted in ignoring all these wonderful folks, Jake patiently made his way with a neutral expression to an unoccupied piece of land. Of course, their numbers weren't enough to form a security perimeter and to limit the risks. He chose to set up camp among the groups of humans too few to compete with the first three factions. There were many subgroups like their own. A couple here, a bunch of friends there. A father and his two kids, a whole family, a few old people, but also some lonely vagrants with their faces untidy and full of despair. Altogether, they formed a fourth faction, large enough not to be crushed by the previous groups. But just barely. Sadly, none of these people could boast of having four beautiful, vulnerable young women in their midst. If Jake was formidable to anyone who had suffered at his hands, he was just an athletic, 1.8 meters tall young man to all those bullies around. As for the playboy and Will, they were not worth mentioning. What was bound to happen happened. One of the gigantic, muscular, muddy-skinned barbarians walked towards them with a conquering stride, accompanied by two of his fellow mates. With their lecherous smiles and their fiery looks, their intentions were obvious. It smelled like trouble. The one in the middle, a tall male with braided fluorescent hair and beard reminiscent of certain Vikings, pointed at Sarah, thundering authoritatively in an unknown language whose sounds resembled grunts. Wash Grafshroom it does grish. Excuse me. Jake frowned in a bad mood. Wash Grafshroom. The giant Cro-Magnon commanded again, screaming louder than ever and sputtering like an automatic water jet. No. Jake replied simply, but in a tone that allowed no contest. For once in her life, Sarah was glad that the feminist hadn't progressed to the point where no man would stand up for her. On the other hand, she also realized that the alien facing them only recognized her existence as Jake's possession. Here, only the law of the jungle prevailed. The group of medieval soldiers from another world, on the other hand, seemed to be under the yoke of the two long-haired, pink-haired noblewomen who stared at everyone as if they were owed money. Maybe joining them would be safer. Eventually, the decerebrate pile of muscle lost patience and resorted to the only way to settle a conflict and get his way that his rudimentary brain knew. Rajam Brashta. The alien growled as he reached out his right arm to his comrade, palm open. The latter ran quickly to their camp before returning a few seconds later with a huge archaic club, at least 4 feet long, still stained with the clotted blood of his victims. Slavishly and deferentially, the underling placed the prehistoric weapon in his boss's hand, before withdrawing with his spine bent, looking down at the ground. Wagrasht. The alien barbarian uttered a loud war cry as he raised his club to the sky, sparking a standing ovation punctuated by guttural screams from his tribe. When the grunting and screaming ended, he pointed his club at Jake with a smirk on his face and a satisfied smile, before resting his weapon on his shoulder. Everything in his facial expression, from his exorbitant eyes to his fierce grin of a beast showing his fangs, challenged Jake to a duel he believed he was sure to win. After all, the wretched human before him only reached his pecs. Fuck you, Jake replied, annoyed, barely holding back a yawn. Drashed? Wagrashed. Oh, looks like you're not so stupid you don't recognize an insult. Jake muttered with a raised eyebrow. Of the factions enjoying the show, not one of them intended to intervene to resolve the conflict. While some felt compassion for the poor human who was about to be blown to bits by a 30-kilogram club, most were eager to witness the public execution. Jake stared at the faces of the passive audience around him, intending to feast their eyes with obvious irritation. He had only recently made it to the red cube and was already being messed with. Was it really marked victim on his forehead? Clearly, since his arrival on this planet, and after absorbing the ether and a piece of Digester's soul, he could feel that fear had little hold on him. On the contrary, he had to curb his murderous desires. These impulses were weak, but he could feel that with less intelligence he could have behaved in a very different way. Nevertheless, if there was one thing he was convinced of, it was that by showing weakness here, he might get away with it, but the rest of his group would be finished. Not that he attached any importance to them, but if it was in his power to prevent a catastrophe, he had no reason not to try. Just looking at you, your species is the kind that has the brain of an oyster in a gorilla's body. Time to show you what magic looks like. He thought strongly. Under the overexcited gaze of the criminals of the second group and the mud-skinned barbarians of the first group, Jake calmly advanced to his opponent. Then slowly, with the same jaded expression, he raised his gun and bang! Everyone heard the sound of a ripe melon shattering as if it had crashed from the 15th floor. After all his mockery and provocation, the alien's skull turned out to be extremely fragile, much more fragile than he imagined. In the astonished silence of the crowd, the muscle mass remained standing for a short time before suddenly collapsing backwards in a big boom. The fight was over before it began. With the same nonchalance, Jake blew on his pistol like a cowboy before approaching the body, picking up the stream of ether that had appeared and leaving with the same measured step. Chapter 61: Intimidation and Probing. Even after Jake joined his group again, the silence of the humanoid factions around him lingered. The display of violence was an eye-opener for all these groups for very different reasons. The group of humans led by a gang of thugs, delinquents, and potential lawbreakers was obviously not unduly shocked. If Jake's execution by gunshot showed that he was a ruthless person, whom it would be unwise to underestimate, who among these criminals had never seen a gun? Both factions of extraterrestrial humans were experiencing this situation much more conservatively. The first group was a primitive people technologically similar to the prehistoric Homo sapiens, or even more primitive hominids. Jake's killing was pure magic for them, a feat that even their greatest shamans and sorcerers could not claim to have accomplished. The sound of the gunshot itself was completely foreign to them and reminded them of the sound of lightning striking a stone. The most fragile ones were still dazed by the thunderous sound. By firing a shot, this tiny human had just proved to them how insignificant they were among the various factions and how size was no direct guarantee of superiority. Just a few minutes earlier, their debauchery was largely due to the fact that the most massives of their tribe felt completely invulnerable in the midst of all these frail humans. Even the omegas of the tribe had grown wings, a never-before-seen confidence replacing their usual submissiveness. Now the poor, decerebrate primates had abandoned their casual, unrestrained orgy and gathered close together, forming a formation similar to an army of penguins sticking together to withstand a blizzard. The poor abused young women finally had a break, but to everyone's surprise they did not seem particularly traumatized or distressed by their harsh treatment. It was as if everything they had endured was perfectly normal and part of their daily lives. To top it all off, their eyes were bright, and their facial expressions were much richer and more subtle than those of their male counterparts, who were just mindless bullies. The intelligence of the females was superior among this species, but their role was reduced to mere outlets, objects of reproduction. Things were different with the medieval faction, always closely protected by its circle of armored infantrymen. Until then, if the soldiers had been vigilant, they were now wearing gloomy faces. While unlike the first group, most of them were smart enough to understand that the death of the giant had been caused by the bizarrely shaped metal object held by his opponent. They had no idea of the sorcery behind such a feat. And yet it wasn't enough to break their spirit. They came from a world where magic existed, and only the nobles could master its secrets. The various and varied hair and eyebrow colors generally betrayed their elemental affinities and were mainly hereditary. Their princesses could certainly produce spells of similar power, but the visual effects accompanying these spells were usually spectacular and explicit. A ball of fire, a cone of ice, a lightning bolt. Nothing that could not be understood at first sight. Spells capable of killing with a simple noise? It was definitely the first time they'd ever heard of them. As for the other humanoid species, some of them seemed to have too little intelligence to understand what had really happened. Only the sound of the gunshot had struck them. However, Jake wasn't so naive as to convince himself that none of the aliens wanted to harm him. He felt a pervasive hostility, the source of which he couldn't locate. Even if he couldn't find a culprit, there were certainly more advanced species than the Earthlings among them. The lack of clearly identifiable futuristic weapons was no indication of primitiveness. Bioengineering, nanorobotics, explosives, emitters capable of disrupting neurons or inducing hypnosis, drugs. There were 1,001 ways for an extremely advanced civilization to hide its game. In the end, each faction chose to remain neutral. No matter how advanced or confident in their strength the people might be, the largest groups near the Red Cube did not exceed a few hundred heads. Even the animals usually considered solitary and territorial, like tigers, miraculously managed to behave properly and regrouped among their fellow creatures. The oracle devices on their paws had certainly not been there for nothing. It was worth noting that most Earth carnivores capable of defeating low-level digesters in single combat had evolved extremely rapidly after their arrival on B-842. Some had undoubtedly been transported to this planet weeks or months earlier. In particular, there was a lion larger than a mammoth that was napping in the middle of his pack of lionesses who looked like simple kittens next to him. What a surprise when Jake found out that Crunch had sneaked up to the king of the felines and was now tickling his nose with his paw. Is this fucking cat brain dead? Jake cursed in his mind, sweating bullets. Luckily, the evolution of this lion had not spared his intellect, and instead of shredding the intruder with a bite like a standard lion would have done, the big feline resumed his nap after having identified the intruder by opening an indifferent eye. Phew, that cat's got a lucky star. He sighed wearily. Concluding that this cat had its own path to follow, he let Crunch play with the devil. When it got tired of it, it would come back. He was aware, however, that the ordeals inside the red cube would vary greatly from species to species. Perhaps the fact that his cat had joined other felines was not so innocuous. After this brief twist, the various factions returned to their tranquility, while Jake and his group got to know the few wanderers or mini-groups that introduced themselves to them. If Jake was always so unsociable, Amy, Sarah, Sophie, Loanna, and even the Playboy were more than happy to meet normal people. At least more normal than the thug who had just shot an even bigger thug a few minutes earlier. The couple who introduced themselves to them were, to their great surprise, the owners of the farm they had visited 2 days earlier. The main reason they had taken the initiative to talk to them was that they had recognized their clothes and possessions on Will and Amy. Since they were only a few hundred meters from their farm when they were teleported to B-842, they had found themselves in the middle of nowhere, unable to find their way back. They had obviously tried to use their bracelets to find their way, but due to a meeting with digesters, they had been forced to flee to the red cube. Terry the farmer was a 6-foot-tall bon vivant with a head on his shoulders. With the changes on Earth in recent weeks, he had never moved apart from his wife, and never without his trusty shotgun. He had long since run out of bullets, but that had allowed them to survive until then. His wife Maria, a tall brunette in her 30s with sun-tanned skin, never went out without a knife or pitchfork either. She wasn't particularly pretty, but she had a well-groomed body and sparkling eyes. They made a handsome couple. Other individuals then introduced themselves one after the other, some friendly and enthusiastic, while others only gave their names out of courtesy or to exchange information. They learned through these exchanges that very few of them had had the chance to witness a blue light reaching up to the sky and serving as a beacon for them. Some had seen it, but had not found the courage or desire to go there, despite the fact that their oracles confirmed that there was no danger there. Indeed, depending on the area of appearance, if the place where the beacon of light was located was safe, the path leading to it was full of pitfalls. The direct consequence was that the majority of them had no idea where they were, what the ether's role was, or even why so many species from different worlds were waiting in front of the red cube. Amy, with a good heart, set out to explain everything they had learned so far, from their encounter with a Slail to their own discoveries. They were all delighted to hear about Oracle cities, but they were not so delighted when they found out that the nearest one was more than 100 miles away. On top of that, they didn't even have the necessary ether to pay the head tax. Others, on the contrary, were determined to stay at the foot of the red cube to forge themselves a future through the ordeals. After all the chatter, night had finally fallen and Jake ordered the tent to be pitched. He would let the child and the mother sleep in it. As for him, he didn't intend to sleep under the stars. He just didn't intend to sleep at all. Between the primitive aliens of the first group who were going to hate him, the second group full of criminals who had been staring at their bags full of food since their arrival, and all those other humanoid species and carnivores all around him, falling asleep would be like handing over his life to fate. He still had 36 more ether points and more than enough digester blood and meat to last the coming night. Chapter 62 Transaction. After his lightning victory, the encampments around the red cube regained their tranquility. Jake's group feasted copiously, with the initial core following Jake consuming some digester meat and pink potatoes, while the Playboy and his groupies had to make do with canned food. No one complained. but you could smell the resentment and bitterness in Sarah and Kyle. Yet, in the face of their previous disappointments, the two swallowed their saliva rather than make a scene. From time to time, Jake would catch curious glances from other factions, especially in relation to Silvermeat. But he showed a similar curiosity and discovered to his surprise that many humanoid species dined on similar meat, sometimes with fruits and vegetables he had never seen before. Because of the cyan salt as far as the eye could see, there was no source of wood available, and so, in order to save electric torches or torches for the more primitive ones, the majority went to bed immediately after the end of the dinner. As promised, Jake left the tent to the child and his mother. As there was still room inside, he also let Loanna sleep with them, since the poor girl had not fully recovered from the loss of her fingers. At least mentally, that would leave after effects. As for the others, although they wanted to spend a good night in the tent, they grinned and bore it patiently, aware that complaining for such a futile reason would be the best way to discredit themselves. The sad reality was that the mild temperatures of the day were rapidly dropping once night fell, and enjoying a good night's restorative sleep would be impossible in the open air. When there was no choice, however, most people often proved to be far more resourceful than they thought they were capable of, and Jake's group was no exception. Kyle, aka the Playboy, offered his groupies to sleep together so they could keep warm, which they gladly accepted, Sarah included. Amy and Will didn't know how to behave in this situation, and Kyle didn't dare make the same offer. By looking at Jake's expression, they could confirm that Jake had no intention of sleeping and that they were free to do whatever they wanted. Will, who was not born yesterday, read more about their current situation and decided that he would keep Jake company during his wake. To top it all off, the night sky was getting cloudy. The purple moonbeams and the brightness of the stars were no longer enough to see properly. This made a perfect hunting ground for all these night vision-capable life forms, and Jake could see many eyes shining in different colors in the darkness. If he couldn't see much, chances were that most of the humans from the other factions couldn't either. The most frustrating thing was that his ether perception stat peaked at 10.5 points, hardly more than a normal Earth human. With his 11.6 points of body perception stat, he ended up seeing only a pittance better than the others. There was no way he could react if another group was plotting against them and took the initiative to strike them down. When it was nearly midnight, and the rest of his group was long asleep with the exception of Will, who was watching next to him, they heard a rustle of dress nearby. Alert, they both drew their machete and saber, and then relaxed, realizing that this was only one of the noblewomen of the medieval human faction. She was one of two pink-haired beauties wearing a long scarlet satin dress. With the drop in temperature, a black fur coat from an unidentified beast now covered her shoulders. Now that they were looking at her more closely, Jake and Will swallowed with difficulty, their throats suddenly dry. The young woman in front of them was a genuine goddess. Only 5 feet tall and not more than 20 years old, she emanated an aura of charisma and dominance difficult to imagine coming from such a tiny woman. With the ambient darkness, the golden glitter covering her crystal-clear skin gave her an almost sacred halo. Her long pink hair reaching to her waist emitted a faint light, as did her irises, also pink. It was the first time Jake and Will had ever seen such a color in someone's eyes, and they couldn't help but be captivated by her charming, seemingly innocent look. To complete the picture, a white gold tiara with the pattern of 2 symmetrical crescent moons joined at their ends repeated itself, the empty space between the 2 moons in the center of her forehead set with a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. An undeniable sign of royalty, which seemed universal whatever one foot's world of origin. Jake realized, however, that this was just a preconception. He only had to look at the other humanoid aliens around the red cube to realize that it wasn't always clear who had the authority. For many animals, whether they were of Earth origin or not, there was the typical might makes right attitude among them. The strongest and most intelligent were in most cases easy to identify. For other humanoid aliens, however, it was a completely different matter. With these species of scaled minotaurs, for example, was it the smaller one with long horns, or the larger one without horns that led the horde, or maybe the medium-sized one with milky white scales? Other creatures looked exactly the same for his untrained eyes. One such life form, for example, had its chitin covered with patches of various colors that seemed painted and unnatural. The only distinguishing feature he could think of was their number, but as far as he knew, it may only be a typical fashion of theirs. Turning his attention to the noblewoman in front of him, he noticed that she was accompanied by 4 royal guards, those who protected the group of aristocrats. Each of them had a watchful gaze and were monitoring his movements, especially the pistol at his belt. "Halt!" Jake waved to stop 10 feet away. "What can I do for you, my lady?" Jake was as antisocial as ever, but the exercises with the oracle, the increase in his intelligence and reaction time, and his lack of stage fright since he'd absorbed a digester, helped make him serene and confident. Now that he was no longer influenced by his social anxiety, he was no longer afraid to stare at strangers, and therefore read their expressions much more easily. "Ele Velius Bolius Cs Harmida," the beauty declared, pointing the gun at his waist. In doing so, she pulled a purse from the inside of her fur coat, undoing its cord to extract a blood-red gemstone. A red ether crystal. From the sound and volume of the purse, there were at least 10 of them. Jake flinched, trying to maintain his indifference, but his eyes full of envy betrayed how tempted he was. He was torn between the idea of getting a bunch of ether immediately at the price of a gun he would sooner or later run out of bullets with, or playing it safe. The truth was that, even though everyone was unaware of it, he still had 2 spare guns, at least 2 boxes of 9mm ammunition, and an assault rifle that he was saving for really dangerous situations. He could perfectly afford to sell one. The problem was not losing a gun, but the fact that everyone would realize in the morning when they saw the young woman with her new gun that he had enough firearms to make a transaction. It meant extra attention that he didn't need. On the other hand, he could effectively do without this weapon, and a gain of ether would instantly boost his chances of survival. Never one to run away from a little bit of trouble, he made his decision quickly. Calmly and attempting to assume his best poker face, he raised 3 fingers and pointed to the full purse with his other hand. No matter how many crystals were in that purse, he wanted triple. With his IQ, even without ever having negotiated with anyone, he knew that ether was the most precious resource on this planet. And if that person was willing to buy his gun for that purse, well, she had to have a lot more. The young noblewoman gritted her teeth in frustration. Contrary to what Jake thought, the young lady didn't seem accustomed to dealing with the likes of him. Perhaps her servants had always dealt with this kind of work before, or she was so rich that she had never needed to cut a price. What Jake didn't know was that the young woman and her sister, along with the entire group of nobles, had been tortured by tremendous anguish since their arrival on B-842. The cohesion of their group was on the verge of explosion. Here, on this planet, their magic was not working. Chapter 63 Enya. The noble young woman was the crown princess of one of the many dukes of the Velcios Empire, which itself was one of the ruling nations on the planet EGA. This planet was older than Earth, larger and more luxuriant. The gravity was therefore slightly higher, and the density of life forms was considerably greater too. Humans fought over the most fertile territories against all sorts of creatures and other humanoid species that the Earth's folklore would not disavow. As a result, the concentration of ether was higher there. Even today, there were many theories in the mirror universe about the origin of ether and what explained its concentration from one world to another. But there was an assumption that the majority of evolvers and players would all admit out of pure experience after a while. The more people in one place, the more ether. And the more spiritually evolved these creatures were, the faster the ether grew. And the more ether, the more these creatures evolved. A virtuous circle. No matter which seed world was considered, any civilization advanced enough would one day feel or detect the ether, and then finally use it. However, there were also universes and planets like EGA, where life forms were so abundant that the ether grew much faster, encouraging changes in the ether code. Living beings not so evolved would thus awaken gifts, which for the natives of these worlds could only be called magic. Like the genetic code, accidental mutations were constantly occurring, and the trigger for these was always the ether itself. At least, that's what most people thought, and what she was able to reveal. These mutations were most often hereditary, leading to the appearance of bloodlines. Each seed world had a fundamental etheric code, characterizing as a signature every element that was part of it, from an electromagnetic wave to the most elementary particles of matter. This made it easy to trace the world of origin of newcomers to the mirror universe. With enough ether and a bit of luck, this fundamental etheric code could mutate as well. This created myriad worlds with very different ether manifestations. And these mutations were also transmitted from energy to matter. The planet EGA had its ether encoded in a form of elemental ether. Fire ether, lightning ether, water ether, and so on. Regularly, scientific mages or the world itself by accident would create new ether particles, and soon they became a new standard of this world. After millions of years of evolution, these lucky ones making up the noble class of Velsios had inherited an excellent sensitivity to an elemental type of ether, which was more classically called elemental affinity among the mages. These affinities being hereditary, one could only feel and control the elemental ether for which one was calibrated. These affinities could easily be identified by hair color, making the detection of innate talent for magic extremely simple. Fiery red hair betrayed an affinity for fire, heat, or blood, and white for light, healing, and purification. This double affinity gave pink hair and was extremely rare on Velsios and an excellent omen. If Jake knew all this, he would probably ask himself, why is it such a cliché? After all, the fire wasn't necessarily red, the blood could be yellow or green, and the light could take on any color. So why were the same preconceived ideas and concepts found in free web novels and video games from Earth? Well, he'll think about that another day. The final word was that the young noblewoman couldn't detect any of the elemental ether particles she used to manipulate to cast her spells. It was the problem of a code, whether genetic or etheric. It programmed our traits and behaviors, but we had little or no control over them. If we took the oxygen out of the air, we would all continue to breathe for a while and then suffocate. It was consciously impossible for a human to filter nitrogen and CO2 from the atmosphere or switch air molecules as the primary fuel. It would take millions of years of evolution, the creation of advanced technology, or a genetic manipulation of the whole body. Either way, it was out of our reach, at least for inferior human species. Since their arrival on B842, their guards had dealt with the most common dangers. Unfortunately, such a large group could be spotted from afar and was a real magnet for digesters. In the course of their journey, they had faced entire hordes of these monsters, and their numbers had been cut in half. On a few rare occasions, the digesters were so numerous and so strong that the intervention of the nobles and their magic had been necessary. Unable to regenerate their mana, they had been forced to use their own reservoir of elemental energy, energy that they could not renew once lost. Although her status as the daughter of a duke gave her the highest authority among this group, the Velsios Empire was a society that recognized the superior authority of the mages because it was based on a very real power supremacy. As soon as it was revealed that the nobles were running out of power and would soon become the equivalent of normal humans again, mutiny would undoubtedly break out. The 4 ducal guards accompanying her were like uncles to her, having watched her grow up from the cradle. And yet, even to them, she had not dared to explain clearly the reason for this late visit. Without her powers, she and her sister were just women with a more trained physique than average. Instead, she had vaguely mentioned that she imperatively needed to satisfy her curiosity in case their faction met enemies with such weapons. What's that? Is it yes or no? Jake urged her impatiently. The young woman seemed completely lost in thought. Returning to the ongoing negotiation, she closed her eyes for a moment before reopening them, decided. Eli Vilius elst Zacne. The lady nodded, taking out 2 more purses identical to the first, much to Jake's surprise. Those big factions were really something else. What he had obtained in battles of life and death, a young and perfumed woman in a satin dress could easily obtain it just by letting her subordinates do the work for her. Inside, Jake was gloating. His first negotiation was a success. A whale like that, he had to bleed her a little more. This woman probably had her own circumstances, but he had his own. The second stage of his plan was the natural continuation of things, showing her how the weapon works, to finally introduce the concept of ammunition and thus negotiate a second deal. Communication proved to be difficult, and when he drew his gun to show her how to operate and maintain it, her 4 guards responded by drawing their own swords, believing their lady was threatened. After raising both hands in the air as a sign of peace and a nod from their princess, the guards reluctantly sheathed their weapons. Demonstrating how the weapon worked was then relatively easy, although it was not certain that she understood the part about the safety catch. It would be foolish if the bullet didn't leave at the fateful moment. Jake's magazines could hold 12 to 20 bullets and were manually reloadable. As for his ammunition boxes, they contained 300 rounds of ammunition each. In the end, Jake, with Will's help, managed to sell 2 fully loaded magazines and about 100 rounds of ammunition for 40 more red crystals. In total, after counting the crystals from the first 3 purses, they had obtained nearly 100 ether crystals, which at this point was a real fortune in their eyes. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Enya," she said with a slight bow, her goddess face deeply relieved and grateful. Then, hearing no answer, she turned around and disappeared into darkness, the 4 guards in her wake. Jake didn't know if it was a farewell, a thank you, or her first name, and the asocial he was had not been able to answer when she looked at him like that, despite the good counseling of his shadow guide. "Jake," he whispered in the night, long after she was gone. "Eh?" But instead it was cries that answered him, bringing him out of his torpor. Chapter 64 Ambush. Let go of me." Jake and Will were instantly on alert, recognizing the screams of Sophie, the nurse with the UV-charred skin. Seconds later, the yells of Loana, Sarah, and Amy combined with those of Sophie, adding to the confusion. Quickly, screams rang out from all sides around Jake. The 4th faction of humans, composed of solitary wanderers, couples, or mini-groups, was attacked by an unknown enemy. Visibility was almost nil with no light source, or campfire, the purple moons and stars being shrouded by a cluster of clouds. Nevertheless, the duo forced themselves to keep their cool and rushed towards the rest of their group, hoping it was not too late. However, Jake didn't forget to absorb the ether crystals with the compress function of his oracle device, not forgetting to give a dozen crystals to Will for his assistance. A few crystals could mean the difference between life and death. In order not to wake up the rest of their group and thinking they were relatively safe with all the other wanderers camped around them, Jake and Will had thought it wise to isolate themselves about 20 meters to stand guard and complete the transaction with Princess Enya. A mistake that should have been of no consequence, since this distance could be covered in 1 or 2 seconds with Jake's new statistics. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it backfired. The night around them was so dark that he could only see a little further than the tip of his nose despite the activation of his flashlight. A few meters before reaching the tent in which the child, his mother, and Loana were supposed to sleep, a sudden feeling of terror overtook him. Bang! A hole 1 centimeter in diameter appeared in his left shoulder, despite his attempt to dodge. Had he been a hair slower, the bullet would have hit his heart. The impact was so intense that he was stopped dead in his tracks and thrown to the ground in the opposite direction, before he could even take stock of what had happened. Bang! Will, who had just witnessed the shooting on Jake, had had enough time to dive for cover, but a bullet pierced his thigh anyway, sending him waltzing away in a heart-rending cry of pain. "Fuck!" Jake grunted as he clenched his teeth, the pain preventing him from thinking straight. He'd never been in so much pain in his entire life. Luckily, now that they were on the ground, the shooter in the dark no longer seemed to consider them a threat. Will didn't look any better, and his femoral artery had been hit. He was losing a lot of blood and was struggling to stop the bleeding by squeezing the wound with both hands. The cries of the camp became more and more panicked and terrified, soon replaced by sobbing or pleading. Howls of rage or noises of fighting also reached their ears, a sign that not everyone had given up the struggle. "Let go of my mommy, you monsters," shouted a familiar child's voice amidst his mother's outraged sobs and screams. A thud was heard, and he was not heard again. Bang bang. "Raph, Hamish, shoot the bastard. He got one of our guys." Miraculously, and much to Jake's surprise, the playboy had gruesome backbone and had joined the fight with the help of his trusty Colt. Bang! The sound of a grown man collapsing to the ground reached his ears. They had gotten the playboy too. All the men in their group had been shot, and he didn't know about Amy and the other girls. The voice he had heard spoke clear English and could only belong to a member of the second group, since each solitary person of the 4th improvised faction had greeted them one by one upon their arrival. and he was confident that this voice did not belong to any of them. In any case, though he may have been in agony and had almost died in vain, his fear of death was soon replaced by an unbridled anger at himself and his helplessness. Even though he had an IQ of over 200 and stats well above the average human, he had been fooled like a rookie. With the darkness, he still had no idea what the shooter looked like and what weapon had been used against him. The only thing he was sure of was that it was a powerful weapon, probably a sniper. Without the Oracle path still active to ensure his survival, he would have seen absolutely nothing coming. Nevertheless, the screams were beginning to subside, and the screams of Sophie and Loanna that he had heard were moving away from their camp towards the second group's camp. The blitz attack by their attackers had been an overwhelming success. Yet fate did not give Jake the chance to avoid the conflict. Sounds of boots were approaching his position, and regularly, he would hear the sound of stabbing or throats being slit. Henchmen were approaching them to finish the job, as though he would just let himself get screwed up without having a say in the matter. Without even bandaging his wound, he spent the entirety of his ether to deal with the emergency situation his body was facing. At the same time, he grabbed and uncorked his bottle full of digester blood and sipped a good half-liter as fast as his swallowing allowed. After giving a dozen red crystals to Will for his commission, Jake had the coquettish sum of 112 ether points to spend. If these criminals thought he'd be easy prey, they were in for a nice surprise. Will didn't have the same freedom of action as Jake, but he also reacted quickly. Sipping his bottle full of digester blood as well, he had immediately consumed the ether crystals to increase his constitution by 3 points again. In an instant, he had felt his head stop spinning and his breathing had slowed down. The wound was still serious, but with the synergistic action between his constitution and digester blood, the wound was beginning to clot. However, he was out of play for a while. As for Jake, he was preparing to kill his first human. The barbaric, brainless alien from earlier didn't matter. To him, the latter was no different than the digesters, and whoever was plotting to kill him was no different either. First of all, his wound had to be contained and blood loss had to be stopped. 40 points immediately went up in smoke into his constitution, plus 10 points. He immediately felt how his bones, muscle fibers, and skin became more tenacious, resisting the hypoxia and inflammation caused by the gunshot wound. As his red blood cells became able to hold more oxygen, his immune system and endurance improved significantly, making the injury seem almost benign. 24 more points were also invested in his vitality, plus 3 points. This investment hurt his heart, but the constitution stats only made him more robust, enduring, and resilient, yet only marginally accelerated his regeneration. The digester blood in his possession was no longer of first freshness and only amplified his vitality by 70%. He had to make up for this difference in order to close the wound and renew the lost blood as quickly as possible. Of course, this would not be enough to put him back on his feet completely. Even with a tenfold increase in his current vitality, such a wound would need at least a full day to heal completely. Even though Will appeared to be healed, he still coughed and complained from time to time about pain in his right lung. What he was aiming for was immediate clotting in less than a minute, even if the clot would burst at the first violent effort, and an acceleration of his regeneration, mainly to be ready to face whatever the future might hold for him the following day. As for the remaining points, even if he wanted above all to increase his intelligence, it would be of no use to him in this situation if he could not react in time. Even if intelligence also improved the reaction time, agility had the same effect at a lower cost. There were certainly nuances that he did not know, but he did not have the privilege of worrying about them. More perception would have been more than welcome on this moonless night, but 3 more points would drain all his ether without having a decisive impact. It was safer to play it safe. Of ether's remaining 48 points, he spent 30 more on agility, plus 15 points, and the rest on strength, plus 18. This time the effect was really noticeable. The gravity that had always drawn him to the ground seemed to have disappeared, and he felt twice as light as before, his strength having more than doubled. The gain in agility was extremely confusing. He now perceived the flow of time around him 3.2 times slower than a normal human being. His reflexes, flexibility, coordination, dexterity, precision, and balance had achieved levels of prowess that he never imagined he would be capable one day. Even knowing that this was possible with ether, there was a difference between imagining it and experiencing it. He felt as if he had traded his carnal envelope for a better one. He had never been very supple, even while practicing the exercises of his shadow guide over the last few months. But now he felt like his bones were as ductile as rubber, his stiffness totally gone. His ether status: Strength, S34, plus 18 points. Agility, A31, plus 15 points. Constitution, C26, plus 10 points. Vitality, V16, plus 3 points. Intelligence, I11 points. Perception, P10.5 points. Despite his injury, he now felt invincible and the enemy was upon him. The time had come to get his revenge. Chapter 65, So I Can Be Wrong Too. After raising his stats that much, Jake felt like a new man. Lightweight, stronger than ever, and tireless. Even with his shoulder wound, which had just stopped bleeding, his predatory instincts had overridden his fear. Hearing multiple footsteps approaching, he continued to play dead, preferring to make sure the sniper had really left the scene. The still erected tent of his camp hid his sight from the battlefield cleaners. The metallic smell of blood and the stench of urine and sweat were attacking his nostrils. With his sight impacted by the darkness, he was unable to determine exactly what had happened. How many had died? How many were injured just like him? And how many had been taken prisoner, like the women in his group? Did they kill only those who resisted them, or were they only interested in women and food? A criminal group of this size must have been severely short of food and resources of all kinds after several days on B842. Regardless, it was not his problem. Whoever attacked him and his belongings had to be prepared to suffer his retaliation. Will was also playing dead, although he continued to press on his thigh wound. Then finally, a boot sank into the salt sand a few inches from his face. When the minion was about to finish them off, or at least make sure they wouldn't return from the dead, Jake took action. With his military knife in hand, he quickly straightened himself up into an uppercut position, impaling his opponent from nuts to stomach, while lifting him off the ground by 1 meter. It was one of the most atrocious deaths ever, and Jake quickly got out of the way so he wouldn't be urinated on when his victim's sphincters would loosen up. The target of his attack was still alive, but he was so tetanized by the pain that only a congested face in a grimace of agony stared at him with an overt incomprehension and resentment. A few seconds later, the gangster fainted and died. The amount of ether that appeared on his body was more than he imagined, almost as much as a digester LVL2. This meant bad news, since it implied that even the average minion in this group had harvested a significant amount of ether. Crouching down, Jake set out to ambush the opposing group's cleaners one by one using his hearing to spot them. The second cleaner was safely eliminated, choking in a pool of blood, with his throat cut. The third was stronger and heard it coming. Bad luck for him, he couldn't see any better than Jake and raised his arms to protect himself by adopting a boxer's guard, which wasn't smart in the face of a machete hitting at full speed with all the weight of his handler. He was tougher than expected, having surely increased his strength and constitution. His machete failed to cut both forearms and got stuck in the bone. However, the impact was violent enough to knock him down, and continuing on his way, Jake stuck the dagger held in his free hand right into his heart. Despite the fatal blow, his opponent continued to struggle for a long time before finally letting go. It was a tough nut to crack. Even with his newfound strength, Jake was exhausted and dripping with sweat. His gunshot wound to the shoulder was hurting like hell and bleeding once again. 5 ether points. Jake was amazed at the large flow of energy entering his bracelet, almost as much as a young digester LVL3, and he was just an underling. His face was gloomy. The chances of saving Amy and the other women in the group were dwindling by the second. Attacking the enemy base and risking everything, or retreating and licking their wounds. Bang bang. More shots rang out, coming from the direction of the criminal camp. It would seem that they too were under attack. If he could shoot this sniper and know how he was spotting them in the dark, he was confident he could turn the tide. Almost at the same time, a whistle blew. The few footsteps approaching his position, and probably attracted by the dying yelps of his last opponent, suddenly made a U-turn, rushing at full speed towards their own base. The threat had to be serious. Taking advantage of the diversion, Jake sprinted back to his tent which had held out. only vestige unscathed from the abduction of the women and provisions of his group. The 5-year-old child was unconscious, but when he connected his bracelet to his own, he was able to confirm that other than a slight concussion, the boy was not seriously injured. It was probably best to let him sleep for the time being. A few meters further on, the playboy's corpse lay curled up in a fetal position, his hands clutching a bloody wound in the middle of his belly. Checking his condition, Jake realized he was still alive. The kidnappers were so confident that he would not escape that they had let him bleed to death in silence. Still, it was without counting on his rage to live. Having kept the bottle of digester's blood that Jake had left them at the farm with a note on it, Kyle had waited for the attackers to bite his jacket and walk away so that he could hold back his groans of pain. Then, once he was sure he was out of danger, he had drunk the blood bottle, before faking his death when he heard footsteps again. Lucky for him, it was just Jake. He was off the hook. At least, he hoped he was. With difficulty, he got up, but the bullet was still in his belly. Even with digester's blood accelerating regeneration, it would only get worse if he didn't remove the bullet. Jake had already removed his own with only his fingers, simply by relying on the gestures of his shadow guide. As he became more intelligent, he synchronized better and better with the shadow guide, so that he could feel the gestures instead of having to imitate them after careful observation. Will, on the contrary, did not dare to remove the bullet since it had perforated his femoral artery. To remove it prematurely without precaution would only aggravate the bleeding. More importantly, he didn't have an agility stat like Jake's that gave him excellent dexterity and precision. Therefore, he could only stay on the ground and wait for them to return. Playboy, what's your name again? Jake asked him, scratching his head in embarrassment. Inwardly indignant, the playboy in question could only laugh bitterly. Kyle Gibson. Okay, Kyle, are you ready to come with me and save these girls who are relying on you? From his response, Jake's decision would change dramatically. If he refused and chose to ensure his own survival, Jake would attack the criminal base alone, but with the sole intention of saving Amy. He wasn't particularly fond of her, but he had his own sense of values. If someone trusted him enough to follow him, he would take care of that person. If that person had useful qualities, it was all the more worthwhile. As talented as Jake could be, it was an illusion to hope to dominate this planet alone. At least, it was too soon. The group that had just attacked them was living proof of that. Tyrannical, because they had the numbers and the equipment on their side. Deep down, Kyle was terrified and wanted to keep playing dead. But when he saw Jake's icy cold snake eyes, he felt it was a test, which if passed, could also become a life-changing opportunity. Oh, screw it. He was a man, too, after all. If he had to run away all his life in shame and fear to save his miserable skin, was it really worth living? The difference between a civilian and an evolver, he hadn't forgotten. To have privileges in the mirror universe, you had to fight for your freedom. I will fight, Kyle finally answered, his face grimacing between the urge to fight and the urge to flee. Oh, are you sure about this? Jake couldn't believe it. He was sure the guy had been a pathetic self-centered jerk up to now. So he could be wrong too. Absolutely positive. The playboy confirmed, this time with a resolute expression. All right, then grab that gun. We got people to kill tonight. And take these ether crystals, too. You're gonna need them. Jake gave him his gun, with 2 full mags. These few ether crystals he had found when he searched the body of his 3rd victim. 7 red crystals. Nothing much to be excited about, but to a normal human like the playboy it could make a huge difference. Since you'll be depending on this weapon tonight, I advise you to increase your agility by 3 points to improve your precision and dexterity, and put the remaining point in the strength. For the rest, you must immediately collect and use the ether from every target you shoot down tonight, if you want any chance of seeing the sunrise. Kyle nodded, extremely focused. Aside from the red crystal given to him by a Slayle, which he had already used, this was the first time he would increase his agility. And the effect was incredible. The world was slowing down around him, and he felt in control of his body like never before. He felt a little more confident now. After that, followed by Kyle, Jake returned to his backpack that he had left outside the camp where he had negotiated with Enya. Relieved to see that none of the attackers had picked it up, he went inside without further ado to pull out a Scar rifle in front of a stunned Kyle. Did this guy rob a gun shop or something? The playboy wondered inside, shaken still. Jake still had a third gun, but this time he intended to be prepared for anything. There was no room for chance for what they were planning to do. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, retrieved some magazines, and kept the new gun loaded in his hand, all set for battle. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 66, Freeing the Girls. Prior to their vendetta, Jake instructed Kyle to stay calm while he was removing the ball from his belly and dressing his wound. The playboy, his face pale and dripping with sweat, tried as best he could to endure the surgery in silence, but to no avail. Tears came to his eyes, despite his own promise to himself to look good and stay strong, the whole thing interspersed with half-stifled squeaks. Jake didn't have time to stitch his wounds, and the bandage would have to do for now. The playboy had used his oracle well when he was shot, though. His reaction, amateur as it was, had allowed him to spare his vital organs. Faking a fatal stomach wound had, with the help of darkness adding to the confusion, saved his life. When the young man had recovered his breath and regained some color, they set off, Kyle following Jake cautiously, clutching his new weapon with both hands. He knew that at the first shot fired, they would be spotted. Leaving the initiative to Jake was still the best plan. As they made their way to the criminals and delinquents camp, which was less than 100 yards away, they found Terry, the farmer, crawling on the ground in rage and grief in the same direction as they were. He had both of his knees broken, his legs forming abnormal angles. His head was also bleeding. He had taken a good blow, but it had not been enough to knock him out. The poor man was giving all he had for the sole purpose of saving his wife from the hands of these kidnappers and would-be rapists. His love and devotion was more than admirable. His wife probably meant everything to him. With a sigh, Jake forced the farmer to drink from his digester blood canteen before forcing him to retreat. Let me handle this. If we can save your wife, we'll bring her back. As if relieved, the farmer smiled in gratitude before fainting for good. We're moving on, Jake just said in a sinister tone, which sent shivers down the spine of the playboy. Bang, 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 ta-ta-ta-ta. As they quietly moved closer to the enemy camp, gunfire became more frequent. However, their camp seemed perfectly peaceful. Better equipped than their group, the prominent members all had their own tents, with 3 large canvas pavilions in the middle spacious enough to live in. The duo could now hear the sound of voices and plaintive yells as they approached. Male voices discussing and commenting on their comrades' blitz operation and rejoicing over their spoils, but also female voices sobbing and calling for help. Men were also sobbing and imploring, some of these criminals having clearly switched sides. Their slaves and other prisoners and victims were sleeping in the cold out in the open, huddled together. From time to time, one of the men would come out of a tent to grab one of the women outside in more or less good condition before dragging her inside the tent. The shouting and pleading would then start all over again. Jake had to squeeze Kyle's shoulder hard to keep him from doing something stupid. It wasn't time yet. Now that they were in place and the sniper and some of their forces were busy elsewhere, it was time to take advantage and act quickly. The first step would be to take out the soft targets one by one without alerting anyone. With the exception of the central pavilion from which a faint glow was escaping, presumably that of a smartphone flash, the camp had no source of light. With such a large group, hogging the smartphones and turning them off to save their batteries was the first decision they would have to take if they wanted to keep a source of light at night for a long time. Shushing Kyle, Jake snuck to the farthest tent in the camp where guttural grunts of pleasure escaped, mixed with tears. At least he didn't recognize the voices of Amy and the other girls. Holding his breath, he cut an opening in the canvas with his knife, only to bump into the back and hairy buttocks of a naked man pressing and thrusting back and forth his tiny weenie into the poor unwilling woman beneath him. Well, not exactly the patient type either. Jake immediately offered him the privilege of being penetrated without consent too, the only difference being that it was a military knife with a 30-centimeter blade, which he stuck in the middle of his throat, from left to right. With his windpipe and vocal cords severed, the rapist died within seconds, a gurgling sound full of resentment testifying that he did not like being on the receiving end. Karma. There was almost an incident in the execution of his rescue that could have ruined everything. The young woman who had been raped a few seconds earlier started to panic when warm blood splashed in her face. After all, with the darkness and all those aliens out there, Jake's intervention was scarier than anything else. He barely intercepted her scream of terror, placing the palm of his hand against her mouth while shushing her agitatedly. Feeling that it was another man, she calmed down. After several days of mistreatment in the midst of this group, she knew that as long as she remained attractive, no man would intentionally want her dead. She could even take advantage of it. "You're free. Wait a few minutes in silence, then you can run away," he whispered to her, trying to be as pleasant and accommodating as possible. Not exactly his forte either. Afterwards, Jake continued murdering minions resting, eating, or fornicating in their tents, reaping a sizable ether loot. 2 of them took more than a minute to die, and this even after their carotid arteries had been severed, a sign that their constitution and vitality was even superior to his. Moreover, he could also feel some resistance in their skin when he stabbed them. Jake was beginning to realize that he was nothing special on the scale of all mankind. After all, statistically, 1 person in 50 had an IQ over 130, and many more had practiced martial arts, or performed trades requiring martial skills that he could not decently acquire in a few months, even with a device like the Oracle. Not to mention the military, mercenaries, smugglers, and other mafia groups who lived this daily. The more he killed, the more he realized that these people he thought were a simple coalition of criminals at the beginning were in fact much more organized and competent than he had imagined. Finally, after 7 or 8 tents, Jake found an empty tent with Sophie and Loanna naked and tied up, with several bruises and contusions. At first glance, nothing irreversible had happened to them yet. When they saw a man's silhouette entering the tent, they cried out in fright. As luck would have it, Jake's criminals had had the good-bad idea to gag them. "Shoo, it's me," he whispered again. "I've come to set you free. Where are Amy and Sarah?" After having untied them and removed their gag, Loanna explained the situation with an incoherent speech, clearly in shock. Losing her fingers, then what had just happened to them finally made her crack. With Sophie's help, and after a while he finally got the gist of it. Amy had suddenly gone into berserk mode and knocked out 2 of their attackers, which had caused her to get knocked out in response and take a good beating. After that, one of the guys mentioned that she was a special talent and ordered her to be taken to the chief's pavilion. As for Sarah, another man had dragged her into his tent as soon as they arrived here without them being able to do anything. Unfortunately, he couldn't afford to search all the tents. The gunman could have come back at any time now. On the other hand, if Amy was unconscious next to their leader, he would have to jump into the lion's den if he wanted to save her. "Where are our food and backpacks?" he asked in a hurry. In their leader's tent." Loanna stuttered between hiccups with great difficulty, struggling to return to her normal state. The choice was no longer possible. His and Will backpacks were all they had left. Saving them without getting their supplies back would only postpone the inevitable. "No choice. I'll have to take my chances. Take their weapons if you find any. I'll create a diversion. The first shot you hear, run away and get what you can from the empty tents. Kyle, stay with the girls." The playboy gladly accepted, for the moment both glad and disappointed that he was useless. The women equipped themselves with bats and knives that Kyle had picked up behind Jake. The latter then escaped from the tent first, sneaking in behind the central pavilion. Sticking his ear to the canvas, he heard men's voices arguing about something. Their squad of shooters was late. Chapter 67. Who is the hunter? Who is the prey? "Boss, what the hell is Lamine doing?" A man with an island accent complained. He should have been back long ago. Knowing him, he must be enjoying himself like a little fool. It's been a long time since he's had such a good time. Another lower male voice with an accent that Jake thought was African replied. Bang. Ta-ta-ta. Bang. He's having fun, but his shots are getting closer and closer, and our ammunition isn't infinite. A third voice intervened after a short silence. Indeed. The second voice grumbled in response. He was simply to attack the humans without faction and neutralize any possible threats. Most of our men have already returned with their spoils. His tardiness worries me. Ta-ta-ta-ta. Taking advantage of another round of fire, Jake slashed the canvas of the pavilion to get a visual feedback of the situation inside. The boss, the second voice, was a 1.9 m tall, physically fit, black man close to 40 years of age. His frizzy hair was shaved very short. His face and forearms were covered with cigarette burns, a sign of abuse and mistreatment in his youth. He wore old military clothes salvaged from the army of some African dictatorship. Medals and other pins covered his uniform. Like Jake, he had a machete in his belt and a standard military knife and a revolver. A rifle without accessories was slung across his shoulder, perhaps a Kalashnikov or an AK-47. Dated weapons. His cold bird of prey gaze and his aquiline nose gave him a severity, reflecting how ruthless he must surely be with his enemies. This man had a history, but also many vices. When he saw him, Jake knew instantly that he would be a tough opponent. Alongside two other men, an African man in a similar uniform and a white man with a shaved head and wearing sunglasses at night, were displaying serious expressions. Both were also equipped with the same paraphernalia and had the confidence and posture of experienced soldiers. By the way, what's the deal with that chick you brought me? The man who had to be the leader changed the subject. Following his gaze, Jake noticed Amy's body, also naked and unconscious. Seriously, what was wrong with these guys stripping every woman they captured? From the beginning of the kidnapping until now, it must have been a total of maybe 20 minutes. Well, apparently, when Saya kicked the kid, she went crazy and knocked him out with a good jab. The bald guy with the sunglasses chuckled back. It was so unexpected, we had to bludgeon her down with a club. She's going to be out cold for quite a while. Oh, whacking Saya in one fell swoop with her petite frame. That's pretty damn impressive. Let's check her ether level. The other soldier commented, suddenly excited. Boss, I don't have the ether scanner, so I'll let you do the honors. All right, let me do it. That freaked Jake out. Checking ether levels by scanning a target was possible. Without the person's consent? Without touching the bracelets? If it was dangerous for him. If he was spotted, forget the surprise effect, and he would be machine-gunned by 3 professional mercenaries. His concern was confirmed, but he relaxed again soon after. To activate his scanner, their leader had to get close to Amy, less than a meter from her body. If the range was that limited, he had nothing to worry about. It's done. Average ether level 11 points. Highest stats 13 points. Lowest 10 points. Their leader announced with a frown, visibly confused. Even if her strength was her highest stats, that shouldn't be enough to disable Saya with a single jab. It would take a perfect blow to the temple or whiplash to do that. I doubt she had that level of skill. The report indicated that she was punching and kicking any way she could, without any special skills. Clearly an amateur. Their leader remained silent for a few seconds, pensively scratching his goatee. In this case, there's only one explanation. Their leader finally concluded with a definite tone. She's got an ether skill like Lamine. The two right-hand men were both shocked and envious. Lamine was already an incredible marksman before we arrived on this goddamn planet. The chief refreshed their memories. But since he awakened his perfect sight skill, he has become unfathomable. Even I would have a hard time standing up to him. As long as he has his eyes and a sniper rifle, he's invincible. Suddenly, a shapeless mass crashed against the canvas of the pavilion before rolling indoors as best it could. This one turned out to be a man in a pitiful state with short black hair and mixed skin, in his mid-30s, wearing a military uniform similar to the other 3. A huge sniper rifle, maybe a Barrett, was strapped across his shoulder, while he held in each hand an automatic machine gun. The man was dripping with sweat and running out of bullets. His long beard was pissed off, and the turban that was supposed to be wrapped around the top of his skull was completely undone. This man was Lamine the marksman, the same man who took out Jake, Will, and the playboy without breaking a sweat. He had no apparent wounds, but he appeared to be at the end of his life, without the composure normally expected of a battlefield veteran. Lamine, what the hell happened to you? The 3 mercenaries shouted, helping him up in a hurry. Looking haggardly, the sniper tried in vain to come to his senses after his aerobatics and rough landing. Shaking his head and slapping himself to wake up, he finally remembered the mess they were in. Yerode, we've got to get out of here now, or we're all dead. We should never have made a move tonight. When Lamine spoke, he had a slight accent that Jake didn't recognize, but the tremor in his voice, thinner than usual, indicated how serious the threat was. His leader, the one called Yerode, had absolute confidence in his best shooter and made the decision immediately. Let's get out of here. Get what you can. He gave the order in a manner that would not tolerate any refusal. What about the rest of our men? The bald white man asked. We'll leave them behind as a diversion. Yerode decided with a grim face that made their blood run cold. Yerode had many faults, but if he was still alive today, it was mainly because he always put his own survival above all else. Within seconds, the quartet picked up their pre-prepared backpacks before rushing out the door. Unfortunately, luck was not on their side. The bald man in sunglasses who led the way barely managed to put one foot out before being sent flying in the opposite direction at the speed of a rifle bullet through the pavilion canvas. Holy shit! Jake and the three mercenaries watched the scene, frozen in terror. Even in front of the giant bear and the digester knight, he hadn't felt death so close. Showing their experience as veterans, the still-living trio quickly came to their senses, raining a cloud of bullets down on the newcomer at the entrance to the pavilion. The problem was that in front of them, there was nothing. The bullets ricocheted off an intangible form, a sign that their bullets were hitting the mark, but no roar of pain or spurt of blood told them that their shots were working. Keep firing backwards. We'll escape through the hole Theo opened for us against his will. God bless his soul. Their leader bellowed, trying to cover the sound of the bullets with his voice. Once inside the pavilion, and under the fire of the still-lit smartphone flash, the enemy revealed itself to them. It was a humanoid creature more than 2 meters tall, massively muscular with a membranous obsidian skin. It seemed to be equipped with a helmet shaped like the head of some indescribable monster. Underneath, a huge gaping mouth with thousands of teeth like a lamprey. No eyes but thousands of luminescent dendrites as hair from a few centimeters to several meters long, smelling and perceiving the environment around it, as if each one had a life of its own. An armor in an unknown metal protected the vital parts of the creature, including a breastplate, arm guards, leggings, and shoulder pads. The creature held a sort of black blade that seemed to grow from an accessory above its wrist. The dendrites acting as hair were deflecting the bullets non-stop. After a short time, the creature seemed to adapt to the new environment. The dendrites wrapped around its body, and like a perfect chameleon, the alien became invisible again, blending into the scenery. The newcomer, satisfied, emitted an ultrasonic roar that shattered his eardrums. Then, as if provoked, it charged at more than 100 kilometers an hour towards the three mercenaries. Oh God, forgive. The other African mercenary didn't even have time to say his last prayers as the creature rammed him with all its weight, the dendrites riddling him with thousands of holes in an instant before tearing him to pieces. Yerode and Lamine had not once looked back, taking advantage of their accumulation of ether to gain as much distance as possible. The alien roared again before leaping in pursuit. Amy's unconscious body had been completely ignored from start to finish. As for Jake, like the Playboy earlier, he was playing dead. Chapter 68 Femme Fatale. Several minutes after the alien leapt in pursuit, and the sounds of gunfire became distant. Only then did Jake dare to stop faking his death. Cautiously, he slowly got up and looked around. A few meters behind the tent, the bald white man in sunglasses was living his last moments. After being blown into the air by such a monster, the bones of his body were broken through and through, and he suffered a lot of internal bleeding. To Jake's surprise, the alien had ignored the dying prey, preferring to pursue the two faster leaders who had escaped first, which made no sense to him. The only reason to hunt other creatures besides food was to steal resources or acquire ether. Any other reason wasn't rational. As ferocious as this alien may seem, its equipment, strength, and technology was a sign of a highly evolved and technologically advanced extraterrestrial species. In other words, if the two mercenaries didn't have anything special on them, it meant that the creature was hunting them for sport. If Jake pushed the reasoning further, it meant that by attacking the humans without a faction that night, they had drawn attention to them from these aliens, which would never have happened if they had stayed warm and cozy in their camp. Earlier in the day when they arrived at the foot of the red cube, Jake had sensed hostile glances as he executed the primitive alien human who had challenged him to a duel. Perhaps if he had shown more direct physical and martial prowess, instead of relying on the advantage of his gun, he would have been the one attacked that night. Just thinking about it, he was shivering. He was also certain about another detail. This alien didn't have that much ether. He couldn't verify it, but his instincts told him that somehow the body of this humanoid was simply monstrously superior to them. Jake hadn't forgotten the crucial information about his body status that loudly proclaimed inferior humanoid species. As time went by, He relied more on his ether status, which reflected the overall amplification of his stats compared to the normal human. Body status was different, since it depended on the genetic code and the laws of physics. Training physically or mentally, for example, could not improve the speed of reaction beyond a certain limit. In other words, the perception of time was the same for everyone, more or less. Bonus info: children see time passing in slow motion 1.1 times slower than adults. Elderly people process information more slowly and see time passing faster. What changed in top athletes or martial artists were the reflexes. Reflexes were programmed to respond to situations without going through the conscious brain. This meant that no matter how much agility or intelligence the body status showed, its reaction speed would not change or would change only slightly, at least as long as he was human. If this alien had a body 10 times stronger than a human, titanium bones, metal fibers for muscle, and a brain calculating faster than a supercomputer, then with only 10 points of ether, he could pulverize a human with several times the amount of ether. It was a fundamental boundary separating two species at different evolutionary levels, something impossible to overcome unless the ether advantage became overwhelming or somehow we could evolve beyond human genetic limits. In any case, concern about this issue in the present situation was futile. Dealing with and solving problems one by one as they arise was Jake's new motto. And for a renowned former procrastinator like him, it was no small feat. As a good opportunistic scavenger, Jake took advantage of the fact that the bald mercenary was drawing his last breath to amass a sizable amount of ether on his corpse. 7 points. That was the largest amount of ether he ever got in one go. That meant that this man was as strong as a rank 3 theoretical digester. No wonder he survived a percussion like that. If Jake had gotten him to drink digester blood, he might even have made it out alive. He suspected the leaders of this mercenary group had monopolized the ether, forbidding their men to absorb it directly from their victims. It was the only logical way to explain how such stats were possible, unless, of course, they fought to the death against an army of monsters. But if that was the case, Jake was certain they would never have gotten away with it. Their firearms were sorely lacking in numbers. The last possibility was that the group of criminals had many more men in the beginning and that the dead had allowed the living to evolve faster, but a mass execution was not impossible either. If Jake, Amy, and Will could settle for farm animals, so why not these criminals on their fellow humans? Satisfied, Jake cautiously entered the tent to find a disoriented Amy, slowly coming to her senses. When she saw his face in the light of the flash of the smartphone still on in the pavilion, she immediately covered her private parts with a cute cry of panic. "What the hell happened?" she said, trying to recall the events. "I remember trying to defend the kid, nothing after that." "Well, basically you got knocked out, then brought in here and stripped like all the other women camped out next to us," Jake explained. The majority of the men were either severely injured or killed. The kid's okay, but he took a pretty good blow to the head. "Oh, that's good to hear." Amy breathed a sigh of relief. "Can I have my clothes?" Jake realized the kidnapped women's clothes were indeed in the pavilion next to the mercenaries' loot. Also present were the backpacks of supplies that had been stolen from them. "Gentlemen," but unable to recognize her clothes amidst the pile, he gave her some privacy and decided to turn around. This didn't stop him from asking a few questions to save time, which made the young woman extremely uncomfortable about having to change a few meters away from a man who could turn around at the slightest pretext. She had been unconscious, but had apparently come to her senses several minutes ago, feigning unconsciousness to avoid drawing attention to herself. Sure enough, Jake and Kyle weren't the only Oscar-winning actors tonight. "Sarah? I don't know either. I was already unconscious." I heard their leader jokingly mention a guy named Joey who had gone to taste the quality of tonight's loot. Apparently, they were unhappy that he'd gone off to have fun without them. "If that's Sarah, you've got to save her right now." Jake frowned, baffled by her reaction. Even this morning, they seemed to hate each other. Maybe there was some kind of universal female solidarity about these things. "All right, I will," he promised. "But there's one person no one told me about tonight. Where's the kid's mother?" Remembering something, Amy's face decayed from grief. Jake knew right away that something terrible had happened. When they attacked us and knocked the kid out, she went crazy. Halfway to their camp, one of the guys hit her on the head with a bat, and she didn't get up after that. There was blood everywhere. I think she's dead. I got knocked out right after that. Jake closed his eyes for a moment and massaged his temples. It was his second failure of the evening. The first was being shot like a rookie. The second was that he couldn't save that woman in time, leaving a kid an orphan. Nevertheless, it was time to move on. He had done his best, and he didn't owe these people anything. He would do his best to save Sarah, even though it was probably already too late. Once Amy was dressed, he entrusted her with their provisions, the poor young woman disappearing almost completely under all the bags. Her frenzy skill was still active under stress, and she managed to carry everything as best she could. He showed her the position of their camp before separating at the entrance to the pavilion. The camp was in turmoil. The appearance of the alien and the gunfire had driven everyone away, prisoners and criminals alike. It was silent and empty now. But this did not deter Jake, and he searched the empty tents and pavilions one by one. When there were only a few left to search, he found a naked Sarah covered in blood in one of them. The body of a naked man lay nearby, drained of blood by multiple stab wounds. Opposite, a Sarah sitting in shock, her knees bent against her chest, held a military knife, probably snatched from her victim, with a ferocious, beastly expression on her face. He couldn't tell if the mercenary had managed to dip his biscuit, but for sure it didn't end well for him. He was discovering Sarah in a new light tonight. The woman had character. Chapter 69. It was a long night. A few minutes earlier, Amy, Sarah, Sophie, and Loanna were stripped naked and thrown like sacks of potatoes in the middle of a tent under the perverse laughter of their kidnappers, whose features they could not see clearly in the ambient darkness. Finally getting some respite, bound, naked and gagged in the middle of a basic tent, the four women found themselves abandoned to all sorts of anguish. Even before they had time to foment any kind of plan, a man with the look of a lecherous beast entered the tent, palpated them one by one as if he was weighing melons in the market, before resting his choice on the young blonde with voluptuous curves. Baffled and panicked, Sarah was torn from her friends without being able to say or do anything. She was dragged through the cold sand on what she thought was about 30 meters before being thrown headfirst into another tent. The thug was undoubtedly excited and impatient, and she could hear him unbuttoning his belt behind her, then taking off his pants before throwing his full weight on her, eager to satisfy his impulses. Still tied up and unable to resist, Sarah's brain was in full swing, thinking like never before. Then she remembered that she had an oracle device dedicated to solving exactly this kind of situation. Sarah was a selfish and arrogant young woman, manipulating men to achieve her ends, while giving them what they wanted from her. A great man once said, "Loving someone is all about loving yourself." When one fell in love with the ideal person capable of satisfying one's deepest needs. Need for affection, tenderness, sex, affinities of character, humor, and hobbies for sociability. Ideal beauty to generate attraction. When a man or woman cheated on their husbands or wives, it was because their needs had changed and were no longer satisfied. In the same way, when the woman or man you were madly in love with dumped you, the only reaction would be sadness, resentment, and sometimes anger or hatred. Whoever really loved unconditionally should in fact just be happy for that person and wish him or her the best. Impossible, right? Sarah understood that. Men loved her for her looks, her bed skills, or her laughter, and she loved them for the money, pleasure, usefulness, or reputation they would bring her. She had slept with many men to get what she wanted, not always very handsome, but she had never been forced to. In the 22nd century, sayings like "a key that opens all locks is good," "a lock that can be opened by all keys is trash," had long since fallen into oblivion. Macho or racist judgments still existed, but on the whole morals had evolved in the right direction. Sarah had never felt dirty or unclean and had never felt any shame for her actions. The end justified the means. Struggling and squeezing her legs as best she could, she suddenly realized that her impatient wannabe rapist couldn't get it up. The offender was apparently a long-time cocaine addict and had been suffering violent withdrawal symptoms since arriving on B842. One of the main consequences was high cortisol levels and impotence. Realizing that this was her chance, she consulted her oracle to exploit this loophole. The path revealed itself to her, and she committed herself to it without hesitation. Hearing him actively masturbating to awaken his lazy worm, She crawled cautiously towards him, doing her best with her bound hands and feet, then straightening up on her knees pretended to jerk him off with both hands. Surprised by her initiative at first, the rapist relaxed, thinking that she had fallen under his spell or that she was one of those girls with submissive fantasies. For a while, only his groans of pleasure were heard in the tent. Unfortunately, this mistake proved fatal to him. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. A burst of fire in the middle of the camp startled the excited man. Taking advantage of the diversion, she followed her shadow guide to the letter. Without mercy, she grabbed his testicles delicately, then squeezed with all her might. A sound of grapes bursting under the pressure resounded inside the tent, followed by a heart-rending cry of pain. While the man was cowering and paralyzed by the paroxysmal pain, Sarah crawled at full speed to the criminal's belt in total darkness, as if she could see in broad daylight. Drawing a long knife from his belt, she came back to the agonizing man, and with a loud scream of rage stabbed the blade into his heart. After this first stab, she continued to stab him repeatedly, venting all her accumulated fear and anger. After a while, long after the man had drawn his last breath and a filament of ether had appeared above his body, she calmed down. Then, realizing the horror of the crime she had just committed and the sticky blood covering her, she tucked her knees against her chest in a corner of the tent, convinced that she was a goner once her crime was discovered. That's how Jake discovered her when he entered the tent. He couldn't distinguish her clearly, but the clouds blocking out the light from the purple moons and stars had begun to dissipate, allowing a few thin rays of moonlight to pass through. At last he could see something, though very little. Gently tapping her shoulder to see how she was doing, he was rewarded in response with a stab to the heart, which he easily neutralized by grasping her wrist. If he hadn't controlled his strength, he would have broken her forearm. "It's me, Jake," he said, as he made her drop the knife. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized his voice. Sarah never thought she would be glad one day to hear it again. Getting her hope back, she regained in an instant the expression of a confident and smug woman. Jake was amazed at how quickly the change in attitude had occurred. He then removed her gag and undid her restraints. He then let her pick up the murder weapon and absorb the ether she had earned. "Okay, follow me now. We're going back to our tent," he commanded her in the same lackluster tone with which he addressed them during the day. Without knowing why, she found this indifference reassuring this time. The return to their camp went smoothly, and the duo found Amy and the other girls unharmed, along with Kyle and Will. The child was still unconscious inside the tent. Amy then gave Sarah her clothes back, and Jake removed the bullet from Will's thigh. Digester's blood had done its job well, and he had to reopen the wound to remove it. After that, he sutured and bandaged the wound before moving on to the Playboy's injury. Then when things finally settled down, he checked his own gunshot wound to the shoulder and realized that apart from a scar that promised to be quite nasty, healing was on the right track. The increase in his stats had had the desired effect. As the other exhausted members of his group went back to bed, huddling together inside the tent despite the lack of space, Jake went for a walk again. Now that visibility was decent again thanks to the starlight and moonlight, Jake retraced his steps to the mercenary camp, hoping to find the child's mother and check on her condition for good. He found her body easily, lying in the sand a few dozen meters from their own base. After all this time, she still hadn't woken up, and seeing how her face was half buried in the sand, it didn't bode well. Turning the body over, he checked her pulse and breath. Nothing. Touching gently the back of the deceased's skull, he felt his fingers digging into her skull like a broken pottery jar. With a long sigh, he searched her, looking for a memento for the child. Eventually, he found her smartphone turned off, which he decided to bring back. If there was one item that could hold family photos, it was this one. In the mirror universe, there had to be a way to charge or retrieve the data inside, even without the approved charger. Finding nothing else of value, he undertook to bury her with dignity. If the child fell on her corpse when he woke up, it would be a disaster, and out of respect for this woman, he could not let her either to rot in the sand or end up as a nocturnal snack for a group of scavenging aliens. When night gave way to dawn, he finally returned to his camp, mentally prepared to face many more nights like this one. But just as he was getting ready to eat something to recover from his night adventures, the giant red cube started flashing wildly, emitting a piercing noise that stirred up all the creatures. Chapter 70, The Opening of the Red Cube. The piercing sound, like a war siren, echoed to the edge of the dunes, awakening all life forms potentially asleep within 100 miles. Jake's group was no exception. Sadly, the child had also woken up. Given the circumstances, it might have been better if he had remained dormant. His first instinct was to ask where his mother was. None of the girls found the courage to tell him the disastrous truth. Unfortunately, the more they tried to keep him in the dark, the more agitated the child became, searching for his mother all around the camp. Weary and tired, Jake walked with a heavy step to the child, knelt down, and hugged him. "I'm sorry," he said, apologizing with a neutral, uncompassionate expression. "It was already too late for your mother, but she didn't suffer." Having himself lost his own parents 22 years ago in the false Third World War, he knew that beating around the bush wouldn't do the child any good. On a planet where all kinds of aliens and digesters wanted to kill or devour them, preserving his naivete was as good as a death sentence. If he could recover and move on, he would have a much better chance of surviving despite the trauma. If the child was still too immature, stupid, fragile, or stubborn to accept it, he would not last long. Surprisingly, and to the surprise of the rest of the group, the child began to cry silently, but stopped fidgeting around. Deep down, he already knew the truth. The reason the child had survived until then, where stronger adults had perished, was, besides his good fortune, due to an ether skill that he had acquired as soon as he arrived on this planet. As Aslael had explained to them, their etheric code had been altered, and sometimes their genetic code as well. In order to increase the chances of survival of the weakest, children in particular were the most severely affected. This did not seem to be systematic, and the reasons behind the awakening of one gift or another were not clear. However, one thing was certain. The talent obtained was never useless. This did not mean that all these talents were equal, though. The kid's ether skill was both extremely banal, but one that would serve him well until his death. He could sense danger. When his survival or the survival of those he cared about was threatened, he could sense it slightly in advance and extremely acutely. It was a sense of certainty that could not be ignored. A few days earlier, he had unwittingly led his mother to areas and positions that maximized their chances of survival. In the mall, he had not gone up to the first floor where the digesters were resting. Later in the forest, he had always changed directions slightly before the rest of the group reacted. Each time this spider sense was activated, its vitality, agility, strength, and endurance would increase noticeably to assist him in reacting adequately to the threat. Because of his young age, he had mistaken this new sensation for fear, a lethal fear that was impossible to repress. And from a behavioral point of view, it was a good thing. If the fear was less intense, he would have simply taken refuge in his mother's arms. But the sensations triggered by this ether skill would only intensify if ignored. When his mother had been captured, he had known that if he failed to get her out of the hands of the kidnappers, disaster would befall her. So despite all the red signals, he had thrown himself at their attackers to get his mother back, only to be knocked out miserably. When he had woken up to the piercing sound of the red cube this morning, he had woken up with a heavy heart, and by not finding his mother, his distress had only worsened. He was so weak, so small. Because of him, his mother had died in vain. If you want her to be proud of you, you shouldn't feel sorry for yourself, Jake declared, pulling him out of his melancholy black hole. Become stronger and survive to prove that her death was not in vain. Jake himself cringed when he heard himself saying those words. But sometimes a few cliched phrases were well worth a long speech. Hopefully, that would be enough to give that child the momentum of determination he needed to survive. So to get to the bottom of his idea, he handed the child his mother's turned-off smartphone, telling him that his mother's souvenirs were inside, and that somewhere on B842, he might still have his father alive looking for him. Knowing that his father was probably looking for him calmed the child more than any condolences. Then getting up and patting the boy's shoulder to encourage him one last time, he went back to breakfast as if nothing had happened. He'd be lying if he said he didn't use his oracle device to find the right words. But he had done his best. An antisocial, unexpressive man like him was in the end the ideal person to announce heavy news. If an emergency surgeon were to burst into tears every time he announced the death of a patient to relatives, it would be excruciating. For that, Amy was grateful. She knew that she would have been unable to keep her cool in delivering the news, and would have broken down in tears with the child. Since her arrival on this planet, she had felt on the verge of tears continually. Meanwhile, the hundreds of thousands of aliens had all risen up and were actively communicating, some of them through languages that could be learned by humans. Others, on the contrary, were chatting by exchanging all sorts of ultra or infrasonic signals, light impulses, pheromones, rattling, or other obscure processes that Jake was unable to detect or interpret. The suns rose one by one, the sky tinged with red and magenta. The clarity was now sufficient to ascertain the situation of the other camps around him, and the first thing he noticed was that the layout of the different camps had completely changed. Not counting the group of criminals who had been all but wiped out except for their captives, Jake also discovered with amazement that all the males in the group of mud-colored skinned primitive alien humans had disappeared, leaving only a group of frightened women and children. Some animal packs had also disappeared or were fewer in number. Even though he had not counted or memorized the number of aliens the night before at dusk, there was no doubt that they were much less numerous. At least 50,000 fewer. The huge lion that Crunch had joined was covered in greenish blood that wasn't his, a sign that the night had been extremely hectic for everyone, not just his group. As for his pet cat, it seemed to have grown again, starting to approach the dimensions of a small Labrador. His claws were abnormally long and sharp, and his black fur was glossy. It seemed that the feline group it had joined was taking good care of him. At least on that side, he wouldn't have to worry. Compared to humans, animals seemed much more reliable to him. The only human faction completely spared at first glance was the group of knights led by Enya, the noble woman with long pink hair. Yet it was only an impression. 2 of the 20 elite ducal guards protecting the nobles were absent this morning, as were 3 of the nobles. Paradoxically, the normal guards in armor protecting the commoners had been untouched, which was reminiscent of the invincible alien of that night who attacked the camp of criminals by attacking only their leaders. If it was a similar monster attacking only the strongest who had assaulted them, then the people of this Enya were far more mysterious and dangerous than he first imagined. If his eyesight was any better, perhaps he would have noticed that most of the nobles looked terrible, as if they had just come out of a diarrhea several days long. As for Terry the farmer, he was able to find his wife unharmed once the criminals had dispersed. With the help of the digester blood, he had regained some of his strength, but his broken knees had begun to harden in a wrong position. He now needed crutches to walk. A few factionless humans had also survived despite the previous day's attack, either because they had fled or because, like Kyle, they had played dead by hiding in the sand. What surprised Jake even more was that Yerode and Lamine, the 2 leaders of the mercenary group, had miraculously survived. They were hiding discreetly among the factionless survivors with covered faces, although he would have recognized them out of 1,000. Lamine's sniper was impossible to forget. Apart from being covered in blood and in pitiful condition, they seemed to have escaped unharmed, without any compromising wounds. For the moment, Jake could not say with 100% certainty that he could have escaped unharmed from such a beast. After raising his stats, he hadn't really had a chance to time himself. He had no idea what his top speed was and how long he could hold it. But escaping from an alien sprinting at over 100 kilometers an hour would have definitely been an ordeal. Speaking of ordeal, the flickering of the red cube suddenly stabilized, the piercing sound that was attacking their ears stopping at the same time. Then, in front of a crowd of curious aliens, other life forms began to walk out of the cube by the thousands, as if it were nothing more than an intangible portal opening onto the Cyan Desert. Chapter 71 Chominho. As if hypnotized, hundreds of thousands of living beings contemplated the newcomers gushing out one by one from a red cube higher than a skyscraper. The red cube, which until now had behaved like a mysterious, giant, multifaceted crystal, seemed to have liquefied, although it had retained its shape. Newcomers were escaping from it, like dolphins jumping out of the ocean. A first wave of aliens, animals and humanoids of all kinds came out of the cube, haggard and sheepish, with no apparent wounds on their bodies. Yet the experience seemed to have traumatized them forever. They were the ones who had failed, and there were nearly 30,000 of them. Then, after a short interruption, a second influx of newcomers materialized. Those who had human appearances, or at least faces with recognizable expressions, were not as ashamed as the first ones. There were also all kinds of animals and aliens among them. The animals in particular were larger than their counterparts in the previous crowd. Generally speaking, all of them were mentally exhausted, but they seemed more seasoned, stronger, and mostly satisfied. This group was the largest, numbering over 100,000 individuals. At last, after another interruption, a third and final wave of people came out of the red cube. Compared to the previous groups, their eyes were proud and their faces serene. They all looked like they had something different from the previous groups. Obviously, they were the few who had shone brightly during this first ordeal. Humans, aliens, and animals included, they were less than 1,000. Among the latter group, Jake saw a few humans, but also, to his horror, 3 humanoid aliens like the one that had chased the leaders of the mercenary gang. Looking more closely at the previous groups, he found none of these creatures among them. This alien species seemed to be cut out to win. After the red cube had expelled all of the survivors into its bosom, it began to slowly flash again at the rate of a heartbeat. Meanwhile, each species in the different groups joined their own, with the 3 waves of participants blending together to form a large number of factions similar to those outside waiting their turn. Among the humans in the third wave, Jake recognized 3 Earthmen. He was almost certain of his inference from the typical Earth clothing they wore, as some of the brands could not be mistaken. The 3 humans were Asian, with a frail, extremely handsome young man, accompanied by another man and woman who stood close to him as bodyguards would. In fact, he didn't need to question their identities any longer, since Amy did it for him. It's Cho Min-ho. Amy gasped in amazement as she recognized the handsome guy in the distance. What? Sarah and Sophie echoed at the same time, with a startle. Who? Jake and Kyle yawned, not the least bit interested. Cho Min-ho, a Korean star who starred in several famous dramas in recent years. Amy patiently explained with stars in her eyes. I'm one of his biggest fans. Oh, Jake didn't give a damn, to be honest. The only thing he cared about this person was that he had obviously done very well on his first ordeal, despite his androgynous, cowardly physique. With a bit of makeup, a dress, and a wig, he could have passed for a woman. In view of the bodyguards accompanying him, it did not seem impossible to cooperate with others to increase his chances of success. Nevertheless, this was pure speculation, and it was quite possible that their appearance side by side was merely coincidence. Jake wouldn't underestimate someone based on their looks, especially in a world where a few points of ether could completely transform a person via a good middle finger to the laws of physics. To Jake's great surprise, the majority of humans, including a few who were definitely not of Earth origin, gathered around him, some of them even kneeling before him. Like a good and benevolent king, this Cho Min-ho quickly helped them to their feet, before welcoming them with a big smile. The members of the first 2 waves also seemed to bond with the few conquerors who had just come out of the red cube. The same pattern was found with every species, alien, or animal. Once the new factions were formed, the new arrivals departed in different directions, each time heading for an oracle city. The red cube was probably placed in the middle of 4 of them, themselves separated from 4 others by about 200 kilometers. The newly formed Cho Min-ho's faction did not immediately set off. Instead, they walked in their direction, or more precisely, towards the humans waiting to enter the red cube, of which Jake was a part. Once they were a few yards away and positioned between the 3 surviving factions of that bloody night, they halted. Cho Min-ho advanced elegantly, followed closely by his 2 bodyguards, allowing everyone to get a closer look at him. That Cho Min-ho had the typical look of a K-pop star. Handsome, trending mid-length haircut, wearing a comfortable branded street outfit. He had pale fair skin like a young girl's and hypnotic green eyes. His friendly face and smile had something angelic about it, but instead awakened Jake's suspicious instincts. From what Amy whispered to him with hearts in her eyes, he was the heir of one of the largest Korean upper-class families and already managed with an iron fist the many assets of his parents' commercial empire. He was apparently also known for his frail health and repeated absences during filming and press conferences for health reasons. Some said he had congenital heart disease, others that he suffered from severe asthma, or even cystic fibrosis. No one really knew the truth. His 2 bodyguards had nothing to do with the usual bulldogs in suits that most politicians and celebrities used to escort. The bodyguard to his left was a tall man, over 1.9 meters tall, in his 40s, with a slender but firm body reminiscent of a leopard. There wasn't a single ounce of excess fat. He wore a black Special Forces commando outfit with a bulletproof vest and all the gear that went with it, except for an assault rifle and other explosives. His weapons consisted of a gun, a long knife, and a baton. He also had fairly dark skin, a sign of long exposure to the sun, and black hair plaited back with lacquer. That he could and wanted to comb his hair this way on planet B-842 was a mystery in itself. His expression was extremely focused and alert, clearly showing that the safety of this Cho Min-ho was his priority. Nevertheless, Jake could detect in this person a certain smugness, often found in people of power. In comparison, the client they were defending was much more subtle and reserved. The second bodyguard was also a woman in full Special Forces uniform. Although she was carrying a gun and a knife like the previous guard, she also wore a katana on her belt, a sign that she was practicing a kendo-type martial art at a high level. Physically, she was a rather attractive woman of about 30 years old with a slender body and features and a small chest. She stared at them with a cold and stern look, including her client. Her long black hair down to her shoulders tied in a ponytail, and her minimalist makeup contrasted with her co-worker's impeccable hairstyle. Believing that he had got their attention, Cho Min-ho began to speak in a soft but resonant voice, betraying that he was a regular at public speeches. His body language was controlled and natural. "My presence among you is motivated by two things," he declared, while marking a time of silence. "The first is to increase the chances of success of my fellow citizens in this first ordeal in which you will soon participate. I will answer any questions you may have." Many murmurs began to buzz through the crowd of humans gathered in front of him. Some seemed eager to speak and ask questions. The Korean celebrity, however, did not let them do so and beckoned them to calm down. "I'll answer all your questions. I have plenty of time," Cho Min-ho reassured them with a kind smile. "The other reason is that I'm recruiting." A new wave of whispers echoed among the humans listening to him, trying to find out what his true intentions were. They had all seen how members of the outlaw group were treated, especially women and children. Putting his life into the hands of a more powerful group they knew nothing about could easily backfire on them. The non-Earth human and humanoid factions occasionally had their own speakers, but not always. The faction of nobles and knights to which Inya belonged could only watch in frustration as other humans were getting information, while they were doomed to remain ignorant. Even with all their erudition and talent for magic, they could not understand a new language in such a short time. One of the nobles with hair as translucent as fiber optics could read people's thoughts, emotions, and memories. Even without the knowledge of the language, he could understand the intention of the message. A skill he used in his home world to tame animals or extract information from victims against or with their consent, which could also lobotomize and manipulate. But because the ether on this planet was inaccessible to them, he had no way to renew his magic. Using what little mana he had to glean some information that might not be useful was too risky. As a result, the nobles stayed away and champed at the bit. Chapter 72 Recruitment Campaign. It wasn't long before the first questions were asked. The humans remaining after that night were not the most belligerent, and therefore this question and answer session went off without a hitch. The first question was the one that everyone had on their lips. What exactly was the ordeal? The answer was predictable, but at the same time more complex than they expected. "It's a test, but it's a long-term one. At least it was for us," Cho Min-ho tried to explain in clear and concise words. "The red cube sends you into a world that is completely random, but one that echoes our culture, history, myths, and legends. We were all sent to the same place, but I can assure you that the world you will be sent to will not be the same." The explanation raised more questions than it answered. Did these worlds exist, or was it some sort of video game that created a whole open world out of thin air? This was the second question he was asked immediately afterwards. "I am incapable of answering you," the Korean star replied succinctly. "The Oracle system will tell you the terms of the ordeal, your mission, and the various conditions you will be subject to. On the surface, it sounds like a game. But once you get there, you won't be so sure. One thing that is true, though, is that you can't actually die in the first 4 ordeals. As you can see, we got out of the red cube in 3 times. The first wave of people were actually those who were killed in their ordeal. which explained why all these people looked like crap and were disoriented. Dying, even for fakes, must have been a memorable experience if everything was or seemed perfectly real out there. The third question everyone wondered was, how long does the ordeal last? Again, the answer was ambivalent. Well, it depends for whom and in relation to whom. Min-ho sighed, giving sympathetic nods to some of the members of his original group. For you on the outside, the ordeal lasted only 1 day. So we went into the red cube yesterday morning and came out this morning a day later. On the inside, it's different. What's different? Someone dared to ask, while the crowd held its breath. For anyone who has passed the initial conditions of the ordeal, it lasts at least 2 months. The mission itself isn't particularly difficult if you don't make any major mistakes, but it's extremely painful. The first 4 ordeals are tutorials to prepare you for the real ordeals of tomorrow, and rightly so. You won't have time to relax. If you die during the ordeal, according to the information I've just gathered, you will exit the red cube along with the others who have passed, feeling as if you were killed just seconds ago. In other words, your body and your mind are out of time. And for those who succeed beyond the initial conditions of the ordeal, another person, confident in his strength, asked with a strong African accent. It was Yerode, the leader of the mercenaries. Cho Min-ho and his 2 bodyguards spent a few seconds assessing the person in front of them. Among influential people, they knew how to recognize another leader when they met one. All 3 of them could sense that this individual was not a good person, with a lot of blood on his hands, but they didn't care. If you succeed in the initial mission, the mission can be extended. To what extent, I don't know. Several more months, it's possible. How long did you and your guards last? This time it was Lamine, the sniper, who asked his question. This answer. I refused to answer it. Cho Min-ho answered with a slight smile, but his eyes were not laughing. Any other questions? The tension in the air was palpable. Despite his frail appearance, this Cho Min-ho was definitely tougher than he wanted to make believe. After all, he had come out with the 3rd wave. A long interrogation ensued, with everyone asking the questions that were on their minds. Cho Min-ho, his 2 bodyguards, and some of his allies took turns explaining the course of their ordeal, complimenting each other when information was missing. Apparently, the humans had found themselves immersed in a medieval world reminiscent of ancient England, in the midst of a conflict with a neighboring kingdom. Their starting points were often similar, but different at the same time. Some were part of the enemy kingdom, others were servants, slaves, or recruits in training. Whatever role or identity they obtained, they were given the physical characteristics, skills, and information necessary to fulfill their role. Depending on whether the participant was a child, a pregnant woman, or an elderly person, the ordeal was always difficult, but within the participant's reach. The key point, however, that did not vary was that individuals in this world had an average ether level of 8 points, 2 points lower than unimproved earthlings. This ether level defined the difficulty of the first ordeal. It was obvious that this was not England or one of its conquered territories, but another world. The language was different, but they could understand it as if they had been born there, and the names of towns and villages were entirely unrelated with England's cities on Earth. Agriculture was more advanced, as was the water supply and sewage disposal system. The populations were also healthy with good standards of hygiene, far from the catastrophic dental situations and Black Plague-like epidemics of that period of history. The rewards of the ordeal itself were, of course, the knowledge, training, skills, and craftsmanship acquired during this minimum 2-month period. For those who obtained a better rating, the rewards were unique and abundant. Cho Min-ho and his 2 guards refused to reveal theirs, but assured that they were worth all the effort. They were also warned that some claimed to have encountered monsters or been victims of spells or curses. Their ordeal was categorized as a medieval/fantastic ordeal. Many of those who had died and failed the ordeal had been the victim of a supernatural event. Hearing all these revelations, the audience responded very differently from one person to another. Fragile, vulnerable, or fearful people, on the contrary, were discouraged, feeling helpless and powerless if immersed in a hostile world that would continually put them to the test. Most, including Jake, were initially under the impression that these missions would be relatively short, at least for the first ordeals. Others, including Jake again, were eager to take on the challenge. Yerode, Lamine and a few other humans were also determined to get the best possible rewards. Even Kyle, a big Vermor player on Earth, was pretty excited. At least for the first 4 ordeals, the game over wouldn't be fatal to him, and he could always participate in the next ordeal. His life would only really be at stake if he reached the 5th ordeal, which was a problem he wouldn't have to worry about for a long time. The last ones were hesitant, torn between the desire to become stronger and get the rewards and the desire to stay away from danger and difficulty. Cho Min-ho had naturally anticipated these behaviors by revealing all this to them. Now that all the questions have been answered, I come back to my second motive, that of recruiting. He abruptly changed the subject to the field he was in fact interested in. I would like to remind you that these red cubes exist in every Oracle city and shelter. If you don't feel ready, I promise to escort you to the nearest city, pay the entrance fee, and provide you with enough ether to make sure you're fully prepared. Jake frowned. It was a tempting offer for all those people who were scared or didn't feel confident about the chances of making it through the upcoming ordeal. As he scanned the crowd, he saw a lot of hope in people's eyes, but also hesitation and mistrust. If Yerod's group had not exploited or attacked all these people the night before, his recruitment campaign could have been a great success. What guarantee do we have that you're telling the truth, that we won't just be expendable pawns? A pudgy woman, a few months pregnant, dared to ask in a shrill fishmonger's voice. As if he was waiting for this question, the Korean star answered with a cordial smile, devoid of arrogance. Because anyone who joins my group will immediately be given 10 red crystals. The crowd gasped when they heard these words. For anyone who didn't even have the spine to kill a digester LVL0, it was an incredible amount of money. In addition, an ether wage will also be given to you if you serve me well. There are only 2 rules in my group. First, recognize my authority and orders as absolute. Of course, if one day you wish to leave the group, you will not be asked for any compensation, I promise. Jake snickered with disdain inside. Those last words were just empty rhetoric. If they really wanted to leave, he doubted it would be so simple after giving them so much. But he was one of the few who thought so. Most were just thinking about the present. If he really gave them everything he promised, why would they ever want to leave one day? The second rule is that you must give me 50% of the ether you make. Think of it as a social contribution. This ether will then be used to pay you, according to a salary grid that I will reveal soon. Of course, I will be subject to these rules as well. Those who thought they could obtain ether on their own gave up the idea of joining his group after this second rule was announced. But once again, Cho Min-ho had planned a parade. Don't underestimate such a rule. The stronger you are, the more you'll benefit from it. No matter how well you perform, how much ether can you get on your own? If this new organization ends up with millions of members, your salary in ether crystals could far exceed that amount. True enough, if this group gained enough members, they could set exorbitant salaries for those in the highest positions. In a world where might made right, those able to get a lot of ether on their own would undoubtedly be pampered. Joining one of these organizations in its early days would certainly be more rewarding than joining it later, when its power and hierarchy would be well established. So, anyone interested in joining my faction? When Cho Min-ho made his offer this time, the reception was completely different. A crowd of people rushed to him, shoving and jostling each other to join his group first and make a lasting impression. His recruitment campaign was a success. Chapter 73 Farewell. Once the jostling and messing phase was over, a proper line was put in place, each person eagerly awaiting to receive their 10 ether crystals of welcome. Sophie and Loanna were part of this line. Very few people stood back, contemplating the mob of weak and fearful people so happy to have finally found a lifeline in the worst of their misfortune. Jake understood Sophie and Loanna's reactions after the night she had just endured. They were not made to fight. Especially Loanna, who had already lost the fingers of her left hand and withstood more than the nerves of a spoiled young woman of her age could afford to endure. Sophie was a nurse on Earth, and her skills were not to be disparaged, even on B842. Digester blood did speed recovery, but some operations still required human intervention. There were bound to be medical personnel living well in Oracle cities who had never set foot on a battlefield. Jake was surprised, however, to see Amy nibbling her thumb, gnawed by an obvious inner conflict. She wanted to join Cho Min-ho's faction, There was no doubt about it. After a while, and not daring to look at him because she felt guilty, she started to line up. She had found her way. Feeling his gaze and flushed with embarrassment, Amy still found the courage to come and apologize after a while, aware that she must have looked like a real ingrate. But to be honest, Jake didn't blame her at all. That she followed him because she thought she had a better chance of surviving was a credit to her. That she preferred to join a larger group on good terms and led by one of her idols was no more objectionable. In the end, they had only known each other for 2 or 3 days, and their exchanges were limited to a few sentences. Their paths had only blended together for a short time before they quickly diverged again. If destiny so desired, they would meet again someday, or perhaps not. When it was Amy's turn to receive her 10 crystals and shake Cho Min-ho's hand, her expression made it clear to everyone that this was the most wonderful moment of her life, which strongly discredited the image of a capable and rational woman he had of her until now. Fanaticism, whatever its object or cause, made humans stupid. Terry, the farmer, and his wife Maria decided to join the Korean Star's fledgling organization, but it was a sensible decision. Terry was handicapped in his legs and absolutely incapable of performing well on his ordeal. As for his wife, after a night like that, she did not feel ready for further challenges either. Noticing that a few outsiders had chosen to stay away, his middle-aged bodyguard, with a body as sharp as a leopard, made his way to meet them. He went first to Sarah, who seemed torn between joining them and trying her luck with the ordeal. Quite clearly, she didn't care much about this celebrity, and therefore only had to weigh the pros and cons between ease or freedom. As opposed to Amy and the other 2 women, that night had taught her that she could only rely on herself. By entrusting her safety to strangers, her life was flipped a coin. Aslale had insisted on it. The good evolvers were respected, but those with the most prestige and privilege were certainly the players. Even if she could join this group and wait until she was more prepared to increase her chances of success, it should not be forgotten that the ordeal only lasted 1 day on B842, for at least 2 months of experiences with the certainty of surviving inside the cube. In 2 months, you could learn and master many things. Many people seem to forget that this new planet was dangerous, not only in comparison to the digesters, but in comparison to other aliens and humans constantly fighting each other in an evolutionary race. 2 months ahead, even with an average performance, it was impossible to catch up. By taking part in this first ordeal, she might emerge the next day as Jake capable of defeating entire groups of digesters. This would allow her to accumulate ether at full speed, increasing her advantage. If she joined Cho Min-ho's organization, she would be safe as long as no monsters or aliens superior to them appeared. On the other hand, she wouldn't get much ether. Even if their plan was to prepare them for their first ordeal, it would take weeks. Sarah didn't think she had that much time to waste. That's why, when Cho Min-ho's large bodyguard tried to recruit her in person, she made her final decision and refused. The bodyguard, far from being offended, approached her bracelet less than a meter away from her, before saying sarcastically, "Average ether, 10.4 points. That's not bad, but it's not enough. You're making a mistake by refusing our offer." "I'm sure of my choice," she coldly confirmed, then ignored it completely. "Since it's your choice, I won't insist." The bodyguard abandoned his polite tactics, then added, "My name is Kong Jun. If you ever join our group and serve me well, you'll be under my protection. Think about it." From the way he ogled her cleavage, it was not difficult to understand what he meant by serving. What made Jake cautious was that he was also able to scan their ether level. When Kong Jun came towards him, Jake took a step back, keeping a distance of more than 1 meter at all times. "Oh, you don't want to get scanned? That's interesting." The bodyguard then took a look at the client under his protection, awaiting instructions on how to proceed. His expectations were disappointed, however. His boss had no intention of creating a conflict for so little. "Leave him alone. If he wants to keep his information private, I have no problem with that. Everyone is free to decide their own destiny." Cho Min-ho answered him in a kindly tone, continuing to shake hands with the new recruits. The truth was that after the first ordeal, his Oracle rank had been promoted to rank 4. With this promotion, the ether scanner unlocked at rank 3 had expanded its range to 10 meters. When Kong Jun's scan attempt failed, Cho Min-ho had crept up on them slightly, scanning Jake with his bracelet unknowingly. The values he read were alarming. Average ether, 21.4 points. Highest ether value, 38 points. Even with the reward of his first ordeal and his ether skill that he was secretly hiding from everyone, his stats were barely higher. If Jake had gotten an average ether of 20 points, with his highest stats at 120, he would have known that the guy was just a moron having invested everything in strength. But if his highest stat was that low, then the man was dangerous. At no time did he consider the possibility that someone might have bet everything on intelligence or perception. It was impossible and stupid. As a precaution, the Korean star took the opportunity to also scan the other recalcitrant people refusing to join his faction. Will and Kyle would have been ideal recruits for his group. Above average levels of ether and a willingness to evolve, but not a direct threat to his authority. However, when he scanned Yerode and Lamine, he broke into a cold sweat. Those two guys were monsters, capable of taking on Kong Jun and Li Yun one-on-one. How many digesters or aliens did they kill in a few days to accumulate so many ether? It had taken them a whole ordeal to reach those levels. Nevertheless, he wasn't worried. They had their ether skills and the rewards of the ordeal. They just needed to be patient while their organization grew and developed so that his ether skill could finally shine. The recruitment process lasted a good hour, during which Cho Min-ho handed out the ether crystals and continued to reassure and shake hands. His two bodyguards watched over those who had refused their offer, and the other members of his faction welcomed their new comrades. Of Jake's original group, only Will, Kyle, Sarah, and the child named Tim remained with him. With the exception of Will, who had followed him from the beginning, who would have thought that they would be the only ones ready to enter the red cube with him. Life was full of surprises. Once the recruiting phase was over, Cho Min-ho said goodbye to those who refused, reminding them one last time that they would find him in the Oracle City in the East if they wanted to apply in the future. Amy, Loanna, and Sophie bid them farewell, both relieved and embarrassed to abandon them at the crucial moment. There was no guarantee that they would meet their friends in the ordeal world, but the fact that they were entering through the same red cube ensured that their starting points would be close. The one who performed well could definitely help his allies to do well too. Amy seemed to want to add a few words, but finally she abstained and left in silence with her two friends. She was not ready for the ordeal, but she would not forget to whom she owed her life. After the departure of all those aliens and humans who had been recruited by the victorious factions of the ordeal, the cyan sand dunes around the cube had cleared considerably. Jake could again make out the pride of felines led by a giant lion that his cat Crunch had joined. Crunch came to him one last time, rubbing his leg while purring. He also ate one last bowl of his favorite kibble before returning to his new feline friends. They would not see each other again until after the ordeal. Jake then turned his gaze to the gigantic ruby-colored cube towering over them with apprehension. It was their turn to enter the structure. It was time to face the unknown and overcome the ordeal that the Oracle had prepared for them. Failure was not an option. Neither was simple victory. He had to be the best. Seeing the determined and eager eyes of Yerode and Lamine, he knew it would not be easy. Among thousands of Earthmen, fighters like these, there were bound to be many more. And yet, it would be up to him to surpass them. Chapter 74: The First Ordeal begins. Now that the dunes had emptied, the most fearless aliens began marching towards the red cube. In a matter of minutes, thousands of aliens clustered around the huge structure, suspiciously staring at each other. Everyone seemed to be able to enter the red cube according to Cho Min-ho's words, but they still needed to start the ordeal in one piece. Not all of these aliens had been lucky enough to have an alien of their species having participated in the previous ordeal. If they believed that they were all competing with each other, it would be natural to show some hostility. As a result, Jake and his group had no intention of entering the red cube first, willingly leaving the lead to the more reckless or stupid aliens. As Aslael had explained to them a few days earlier, the first 4 ordeals were between similar species. So in principle, there would only be humans in this first ordeal. Nevertheless, if an alien species was genetically similar enough to be recognized as a race, or a different phenotype for those who believe this term to be racist, the possibility existed that they would be shipped to the same world. Jake doubted it, however. At least for the first ordeal, he was confident that there would only be Earthlings with them. At least, if there were other human species, They would be sent to different areas or their interactions would be kept to a minimum. There was another revelation from Cho Min-ho that had also greatly disrupted his plans. According to the scenario and identity planned by the ordeal, their equipment could be confiscated from them. There went his plan to load liters of digester blood in case something went wrong. As the first 4 ordeals were considered tutorials to prepare them and increase their chances of survival in the mirror universe, the risks were much lower and the objective simpler. On the other hand, the restrictions were significant. This was to prevent the strongest from spoiling the ordeal of the weakest. Possession of a gun in a medieval world would destroy the formative purpose of the ordeal and could seriously disrupt the normal course of it. It might not be obvious to everyone, but the ordeal could also put them in competition with the other participants, but that was not the primary goal. The main mission was always individual, but the way to accomplish it could vary endlessly. The only thing he could count on once he made it there would be his oracle device and his ether. With his loot from last night, he had again accumulated 21 points of ether, which could be considered his trump card in case of unforeseen circumstances. There was also a good chance that Tim would be sent somewhere else, given his young age. So would the elderly. Women were also reported to be subject to different treatment, but this depended on the cultures of the world to which they would be sent. Meanwhile, the most powerful and numerous alien factions had begun to squabble over who would have the honor of entering first. For the first time, he realized that the Earthlings were factually pretty stupid. The overpowered humanoid alien who had pursued Yerode and Lamine was uttering a deafening wail sound, while its interlocutor in front, a huge, multicolored soap bubble the size of a man, was babbling a cloud of bubbles without Jake being able to tell whether it was calm or angry. But the most surprising thing about all this was that they understood each other smoothly, in a way that eluded him. He could see them pausing between communications to translate and digest the messages exchanged before speaking once again. The diplomatic approach between these two super species ultimately failed. Losing patience, the thousands of luminescent dendrites of the humanoid alien pierced the bubble, cracking like a whip. The soap bubble then burst with a loud pop, before immediately reforming itself, albeit slightly smaller. It returned to normal size after a fraction of a second. Enraged, the bubble suddenly swelled to the size of a 2-story house, and then abruptly condensed to the size of a marble. The bubble spoke again, releasing another cloud of bubbles. But this time, instead of carrying a message, they exploded by depressurization when they reached the alien opposite. Boom! A noise similar to a chain reaction of firecrackers exploding one after the other resounded at the foot of the cube, blowing away the curious spectators with the force of a tornado. Those far enough to avoid being blasted, but too close to escape unharmed, were completely knocked out, their eardrums, if they had any, bleeding enough to feed a family of vampire. As for the target of the explosion, it survived by barricading itself behind its dendrites, but it had to be said that many of them were now much shorter. A new wave of discussions then ensued, the exchange this time being much more courteous. Lower species such as humans could not but stand aside in the face of such a display of power. Who knew that a simple bubble could be so devastating? This confirmed Jake's decision to enter the red cube at the very end. It did, however, raise new concerns. The first 4 ordeals were between humans, and their survival was guaranteed. But what about the 5th and subsequent ordeals? Could they compete against this bubble and this alien with thousands of dendrites? At equivalent ether, humans were too weak to compete against these monsters. If ether density was the only criterion deciding the world chosen for the ordeal, he'd run into these aliens sooner or later. The 2 monsters in question, by the way, seemed to have finally come to an agreement. They entered and disappeared inside the cube at the same time, like pebbles falling into a pond, then followed their comrades, and then the other dominant alien species. After a good half-hour of jostling and small fights that didn't kill anyone, only humans and other primitive species remained. Even then, Jake let the impatient ones pass, only walking towards the red cube when only his group and a few other stragglers were left. When it was his turn, he gave his teammates a final recap, wishing them good luck, before entering the cube with a determined stride. Contrary to what he imagined, he felt no resistance, no sensation of liquid or viscosity. It was as if the gigantic red cube was in fact just a hologram. However, when he wanted to step back out, he found nothing but nothingness. The inside of the cube was pitch black and silent. He could no longer feel his body when he tried to touch himself, and he could no longer hear his voice when he tried to speak. To be frank, he was no longer breathing and did not feel the need to. He wasn't even sure he had a body. After a long time that felt like forever, with only she and his dreams for company, information finally appeared in his mind, coming from his oracle system. Participant: Jake Wilderth, Earthling. Successful ordeals: 0. Awaiting matchmaking for first ordeal. Species allowed: Earthlings. Matchmaking complete. First ordeal determined. Type: historical, peplum/fantastic. Ether density: 0.8 or 8 points. Number of participants: 8,658,435. Background: the Mermid Empire and its people, the Mermidians, believe they are the descendants of the hero Mermid the Great. They see all other people as inferior beings, only fit to be their slaves. They are a warlike race. The Mermid hero's blood that flows in their veins makes them stronger with every victory under certain conditions and weaker in defeat. To become stronger and satisfy their desire for conquest, the Mermidians are at constant war with neighboring kingdoms and lands, plundering and pillaging the resources they need to thrive. The most valiant enemy warriors are enslaved to fight in their arenas, with the promise of one day gaining their freedom and being blessed by Mermid the Great if they prove their worth. The Throstians, a barbarian people at war with the Mermid, were recently defeated in the Mermid Empire's final campaign against the barbarian peoples of the north. The war is still raging, but they are constantly losing ground, though fiercely resisting. Each defeat leads to the Mermid Empire's acquisition of many prisoners, who are then sold back to the highest bidder by appointed slave traders. In this ordeal, you will be one of those newly captured Throstian slaves. You await your fate in a dungeon of an insula in the coastal city of Heliodos. Main mission: survive 2 months. Penalty for failure: none. Benefits and specifics during mission time: Mermid and Throstian's language mastery. Altering the appearance to look like a Throstian. Blessing of the hero Throstian. Sturdy body equals strength +10, vitality +10, constitution +10, perception +3. May fate work in your favor. Hardly had Jake finished reading and memorizing all these data that a bright ruby-colored light blinded him, engulfing his whole being and consciousness in the process. When he awoke long afterwards, the smell of urine, sweat, and feces attacked his nostrils. He was in a dungeon. The smell inside was nauseating. His tongue and lips were parched with thirst, and his stomach was crying out for food. The first ordeal had begun. Chapter 75: What It Means to Be a Throstian. When Jake opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was that he wasn't alone in his cell and that it was dark. The sun had just risen, but apart from a tiny dormer window with bars that let in a bit of light, it was pitch black. Surprisingly, he could still see clearly. About 20 other prisoners were waiting to be disposed of in the midst of their waste. Most of them were still sleeping. By scrutinizing carefully, he finally recognized with great difficulty next to him Kyle and Yerode, the leader of the mercenaries. Why with difficulty? Because their appearances were somewhat different now. In addition to the dirt that covered them, their almost naked bodies except for a loincloth were also suffering from advanced dehydration. Nevertheless, that was not what made their identification so challenging. Their hair was now snow white, and their bones had been visibly altered. Even Yerode, who was of African descent, had much paler skin now. Instead of thin and slender features, Kyle now had a wide manly jaw and the build of an American footballer. Their arms were slightly longer, their hands and fingers wider. Their forearms and biceps were more massive, and their legs were slightly shorter. Their noses were also longer. All these details did not profoundly change their appearance, and they could easily recognize each other without any possible confusion. However, it was confusing to see such a change in such a short period of time. Raising a huge hand in front of his face, Jake was able to confirm that he had not been exempted from this treatment. He also realized that one hand could not be moved without the other. He was handcuffed. As he tried to get up with difficulty, a resistance and the rattling of chains prevented him from completing his motion. He also had irons on his ankles, and his ankles were connected by a chain to 2 other prisoners, Yerode and another guy. They were stuck together for better or worse. Yerode, who was also awake, growled as he was pulled by Jake's brute force. "I swear, if you keep pulling on your chain, I'll kill you on the spot." The African mercenary threatened him in a very bad mood. First, he woke up in the middle of a cell covered in urine and feces, and now he had to put up with being chained to a crazy idiot. Bad luck for him. Jake wasn't the sociable type either, and certainly not in a good mood either. Pulling with all his strength with his leg, Yerode, taken by surprise, swung forward to land headfirst in the half-dry feces of a former prisoner or long-gone slave. His arms were handcuffed together, and he hadn't been able to catch himself properly, and some of it ended up in his mouth. Cough, cough. "You're a dead man." Yerode uttered a war cry, completely enraged. He hadn't been humiliated like that since his military service in Kenya. In response, Jake took a step backwards with all his might, making the mercenary who was still four-legged in a pseudo-plank position slip again. He regretted his action, though, since after that Yerode bumped into him head first, sending him to the ground in turn. Falling on his back, he couldn't use his hands shackled at the front to catch himself, and consequently felt a compact substance of dubious content splashing on his back when he landed on the ground. Furious too, Jake slammed into him in turn, sending him flying back against the stone wall. After that, the two brutes went on with a series of Greco-Roman wrestling holds, punching and kicking each other viciously when they found an opportunity to do so. Jake had not forgotten to whom they owed their group's attack the night before, and therefore did not hold back his blows at all. Yerode, who had no idea who this madman was, had simply decided that he hadn't lived like a tyrant for 2 decades only to be humiliated by a greenhorn 10 years younger. The fight went on for a long time before footsteps forced them to interrupt their score-settling session. By tacit agreement, the two men sat back down against the cold stone of their cell, once again simulating the behavior of lethargic and dehydrated prisoners. The noise of their fight had awakened almost everyone in their cell, and everyone was staring curiously at them. If for Jake and Yerode it was just another fight, for the spectators these two bullies were more terrifying than two ferocious hungry beasts. The alteration of their appearance, combined with the blessing of the hero Throshjan, had transformed their already hardened physique into real killing machines. The impact of each of their blows made a resounding sound, and their endurance seemed inexhaustible. As for their speed, they were like two jackhammers trying to puncture the other. Even after their terrible fight, they were barely bleeding and no apparent bruising covered their bodies. Despite the violence of their confrontation, no vital blows had been delivered. Jake may have been less experienced than Yerode, but he made up for it with a superior constitution and vitality. Yerode's forte was his agility and constitution, for like Lamine, he excelled with a gun. His physical strength was barely superior to Jake, which was not enough to compensate for the latter's advantage in vitality. Finally calming down and catching his breath, Jake had realized after this fight that the hero Throshjan's sturdy body blessing was completely different from what he had originally imagined. The bonuses of vitality, constitution, and perception had not inflated his ether stats, but his body status. The transformation of his appearance into a Throshjanian also seemed to emphasize stamina and toughness. As a result, he was left during the ordeal time with a body that was unlike the one he had before entering the Red Cube. His body status had changed profoundly. The changes were not limited to a simple vitality +10, constitution +10, and perception +3, but his stats were now compared to the average Throshjanian. Height: 1.81 meters, +0.05. Weight: 82 kg, +15. Strength: 19.3, +20 points. Agility: 15.5, 2 points. Constitution: 19.2, +20 +10 is equal to +30 points. Vitality: 19.6, +10 +10 is equal to 20 points. Intelligence: 16.1, 3 points. Perception: 11.6, +5 +3 points. Upon discovering his new physical stats, he cursed. No wonder he got so easily carried away with Yerode. He had literally lost over 30 IQ points during his physical alteration into a Throshjanian. By consulting the vital parameters of his status, he found that his testosterone levels were more than 10 times higher than those of a normal human, and his cortisol was abysmally low. Testosterone was the dominance and aggressiveness hormone found in men and women of power. An excessively high dose was correlated with increased aggression. Conversely, a low cortisol level betrayed a strong resistance to stress or a relaxed state, and was generally inversely proportional to testosterone. Simply put, in both humans and animals, individuals were generally dominant and fearless, or submissive and stressed. Such abnormal levels associated with his declining intelligence explained his eagerness to fight for dominance against Yerode, even though it was exceptionally stupid and counterproductive in their situation. Yerode had also realized the problem with their actions and now looked gloomy. Unlike Jake, he had never been a particularly gifted genius. His good decisions were based on his composure and experience. With his new intelligence stats, he was now slightly retarded by Earth standards. Had he not invested 1 ether point in intelligence a little earlier, he would have been severely handicapped. From the confused expressions and foolish looks of the other prisoners, they all suffered a severe drop in IQ. Kyle was a student at the university, and Jake could only pray that his intelligence had not fallen to too critical a level. Luckily for him, the playboy was still in his right mind, and with a nod he confirmed that he was fine. Jake was unsure if the other Throstian slaves in their cell were participants in the ordeal, but at least 2 of them had lost their minds, behaving like 2 not-so-smart gorillas. Jake, Yerode, and Kyle were wondering what the point was of reducing their intelligence in this way for an ordeal that was supposed to prepare them to survive in the mirror universe. Unfortunately, they would have to deal with it. Meanwhile, the footsteps had stopped a few meters from their cell. A man dressed in an outfit similar to a Roman legionary opened the rotten wooden door of their cell with a large, rusty, old-fashioned key. He was wearing a bronze breastplate, a navy blue tunic down to his knees under his armor, and a pair of sandals. A glaive was also stored at his belt. An open helmet made it possible to distinguish the face of their jailer. The man was young, less than 30 years old, but there was a cruelty and viciousness in his face that even Yerode could not match. His nose was crooked, his complexion grayish, and his teeth yellow. Jake could not help praying for the Myrmidians when he saw this man, hoping for them that this soldier was not the finest specimen of their kind.